Hello everyone, and welcome back to X-Ranger. Before we begin, I thought it would be interesting if each of you could leave a comment indicating which part of the world you're joining us from. Also, don't forget to like and subscribe if you're enjoying the episodes. Now let's get comfortable, relax, and start our program. I've been a truck driver for over 25 years now, but what happened that night in '96 near Mount Shasta still gives me chills. I've never been one for supernatural stuff or conspiracy theories, just a regular guy doing his job, hauling fuel up and down I-5. But what I saw, well, I still struggle to make sense of it. It was late September, around 11:30 p.m. I remember because I'd just finished my mandatory break at the truck stop near Weed, California. The night was clear but dark, one of those nights where the moon barely shows through the pine trees that line the highway. I was heading north on I-5, loaded with about 8,000 gallons of diesel. Traffic was light, just a few RVs and other trucks spread out along the road. The section of I-5 near Mount Shasta is pretty intense at night. The highway cuts through dense forest, with tall pines on both sides and this thick median of trees between the northbound and southbound lanes. Your high beams only reach so far, and the trees create these deep shadows that play tricks on your eyes. I'd driven this stretch hundreds of times before, so I knew every curve and gradient. I'd just passed the Mount Shasta Vista point, doing about 55 mph. The grade was slight, and I had my high beams on since there wasn't much oncoming traffic. That's when I first noticed something wasn't right. You develop a kind of sixth sense driving at night. You learn to spot deer or elk way before they become a problem, but this was different. At first I thought it was just another shadow from the trees, but then I realized this shadow was moving. It emerged from the tree line on my right side, maybe 200 feet ahead. The way it moved, that's what got me first. It wasn't running or rushing. It was just walking, calm as could be, like someone crossing their front yard to check the mail. Except this wasn't someone. As my lights hit it fully, I felt my blood run cold. This thing was huge. I'm talking 9 or 10 feet tall at least. I know that sounds crazy, but I've been judging distances and sizes my whole career. When you haul hazmat, you get pretty good at spatial awareness. This wasn't some guy in a costume or a bear standing on its hind legs. The proportions were all wrong for that. It was covered in dark, thick hair, not shaggy like a bear, but more uniform, almost like a short-haired dog. The color was hard to tell in my headlights, but it looked dark brown or black. Its arms were long, way too long, hanging down past its knees. The shoulders were massive, maybe twice as wide as a big man's. Here's the thing that really freaks me out to this day. Its complete indifference. My truck wasn't exactly quiet. I hit the air horn as soon as I saw it, and there were other vehicles on the road too. The noise was incredible, horns blaring, tires screeching. An RV in the left lane nearly swerved off the road trying to avoid it. But this thing, it didn't even turn its head. It just kept walking, taking these enormous strides across the highway like it was the most natural thing in the world. I started braking. Not hard, because you can't with a full tanker, but enough to slow down significantly. The creature crossed my lane in about 3 steps. Just 3 steps to cover a full highway lane. Its feet were huge, but it didn't stomp or lumber. The movement was smooth, almost graceful in a terrifying way. As it reached the median, it disappeared into the pines between the highway lanes. The whole encounter probably lasted less than 15 seconds, but time felt weird, like when you're about to have an accident and everything slows down. I remember gripping the steering wheel so hard my knuckles were white. I grabbed my CB radio right away. "Breaker, breaker, northbound I-5 near Mount Shasta Vista Point. Anybody else just see that?" The radio crackled with responses. An RV driver was practically hysterical, saying he almost hit it. A few other truckers who were further back said they saw something big cross the road, but couldn't make out what it was. I pulled over at the next rest stop. about 10 miles up. My hands were shaking so bad I could barely work the parking brake. I needed to process what I'd just seen. There were a few other drivers there, including the guy in the RV who'd nearly swerved off the road. We tried to make sense of it, but how do you rationalize something like that? The local sheriff's department wasn't much help when I reported it. They took down my information, but I could tell they weren't taking it seriously. I get it. I wouldn't have believed it either if I hadn't seen it with my own eyes. But here's the thing. That wasn't the end of it. 2 weeks later, I was driving the same route, same time of night, about 5 miles south of where I'd seen it before. The weather was worse this time, light rain, fog hanging low over the road. I was going slower, maybe 45 in because of the conditions. That's when my headlights caught something moving in the trees to my right. At first I thought, no way, not again. But there it was, same height, same build, same deliberate movement. Only this time it was walking parallel to the highway, just inside the tree line. I could see it moving between the pines, keeping pace with the traffic. I followed it with my eyes as long as I could, which was probably about a quarter mile. It never broke stride, never looked toward the highway, just kept walking with that same purposeful gait, like it had somewhere to be. The weird thing is, I wasn't as scared the second time. Don't get me wrong. My heart was racing, and I felt that same primal fear, but there was something almost natural about it, like seeing a mountain lion or a bear in their habitat. It belonged there, and we were the intruders with our noisy trucks and bright lights. I've driven that stretch of I-5 hundreds of times since then, always scanning the tree line, always hoping to catch another glimpse. But I never saw it again. Sometimes, when I'm driving that route at night, I'll catch movement in the corner of my eye or see a shadow that seems too tall, too solid. But it's never been anything more than shadows and tricks of light. I've thought about those encounters every day for the past 28 years. I've read about other sightings in the area, talked to other drivers who've seen similar things. Some people think Mount Shasta has some kind of special energy or power. I don't know about all that. What I do know is what I saw, and it wasn't human, wasn't any animal I'd ever seen before or since. These days, I still drive that route sometimes, though I'm mostly on shorter hauls now. Every time I pass that stretch of highway, I slow down a little, scan the trees a little more carefully, not out of fear anymore, but out of respect. Whatever I saw that night, it showed me that there are things in this world we can't explain, things that don't care about our highways or our schedules or our beliefs about what's possible. I've never told this story to many people. My wife, a few close friends, and now here. Most people probably think I'm crazy or making it up. That's fine. I know what I saw. Those eyes in my headlights, that deliberate stride across the highway, those memories are as clear today as they were in 1996. Some things you just can't forget, no matter how hard you try. What really gets me, even now, is how it just went about its business, completely unbothered by our presence. Like we were just a minor inconvenience in its world, not the other way around. It makes you wonder how many of them are out there, walking through their forest, while we speed by in our trucks and cars, thinking we're alone on these roads at night. I still drive trucks, still haul fuel, still do my job. But that night changed something in me, made me realize that maybe we don't know everything we think we know. Maybe there's more out there in those dark forests than we're willing to admit. And maybe, just maybe, we're not as high up on the food chain as we like to think. Story 2. I've been driving trucks for over 35 years now, and I never thought I'd be sharing something like this. But what happened to me that night in 1980 on Highway 62 near Butterfield, Texas, still haunts me to this day. I've kept quiet about it for the most part, but I need to get this off my chest. It was around 2 a.m., and I was hauling a full load of lumber headed east. The night was pitch black. I mean the kind of darkness that seems to swallow your headlights. No moon, no stars, Nothing. Just my truck's lights cutting through that thick Texas darkness. I'd driven this route hundreds of times before, so I wasn't too concerned about the conditions, even though the visibility was terrible. I remember I had the radio on low, some old country station playing Willie Nelson, trying to keep myself alert. The cab was warm, and I had my thermos of coffee beside me. Just another normal night run, or so I thought. I was about 3 miles east of Butterfield, in a stretch where the highway cuts through some dense woodland. There weren't any other vehicles on the road. At that hour, you rarely see anyone else. The first thing that struck me as odd was how the crickets suddenly went quiet. You know how in Texas, especially during summer nights, you've got this constant background noise of crickets and other critters? Well, it all just stopped. At first, I didn't really register it consciously, but looking back, that was the first sign that something wasn't right. I was doing about 55 mph, keeping it steady because of my heavy load, when my headlights caught something moving at the edge of the tree line on the right side of the road. At first I thought it was a bear, which would have been unusual enough in that area. But as I got closer, I realized whatever this was, it was standing upright. My first instinct was to hit the brakes. Not hard, mind you. You can't do that with an 18-wheeler fully loaded with lumber. But I started to slow down, downshifting carefully. The thing that gets me to this day is how this creature just calmly walked out onto the highway. It didn't run or bolt like a deer would. It didn't seem startled by my truck at all. As it stepped into the full beam of my headlights, I felt my whole body go cold. This wasn't a bear. It wasn't anything I'd ever seen before. The thing was massive. I'd estimate around 7 to 8 feet tall. It was covered in dark, matted hair, but it wasn't like any animal fur I'd ever seen. It looked almost, well, human-like in its texture, if that makes any sense. What really got to me was how it moved. Despite the darkness, this thing navigated like it could see perfectly. Its movements were smooth and deliberate, almost like it was taking a casual stroll. Here I am, wrestling with visibility in a modern truck with powerful headlights, and this creature is just walking around like it's broad daylight. I had slowed down to maybe 20 mph at this point, and I swear, this thing turned its head and looked right at me. Its face, I still have trouble describing it. It wasn't quite human, but it wasn't fully animal either. The eyes caught the reflection of my headlights, but not like a deer's eyes would. They seemed intelligent. That's the only word I can think of. The creature took about 4 or 5 steps to cross the highway completely. Each step was purposeful, unhurried. Its arms were long, longer than a human's proportionally, and they swung slightly as it walked. Its feet were huge and bare, leaving prints in the loose gravel on the shoulder of the road. What strikes me most when I think back to that moment is the absolute silence. The engine of my truck was running, of course, but beyond that, there was this overwhelming quiet. No wildlife sounds, no wind, nothing. It was like everything in nature was holding its breath. As it reached the other side of the road, it turned its head once more in my direction. Just a slight turn, but enough that I could tell it was looking at me again. Then it simply disappeared into the darkness of the woods on the other side. No rushing, no crashing through the underbrush. It just melted into the shadows like it belonged there. I sat there for a moment, my hands gripping the steering wheel so tight my knuckles were white. My coffee had spilled somewhere during the encounter, but I didn't even notice until later. I was shaking, but I managed to put the truck back in gear and continue on my route. The rest of my drive that night is a blur. I remember stopping at the next rest area and just sitting there for a while, trying to process what I'd seen. I've spent countless hours since then trying to rationalize it, trying to convince myself it was just a bear or some other animal. But I know what I saw. What bothers me most isn't just the creature itself, but how deliberate and purposeful it was. This wasn't some animal randomly crossing the road. The way it moved, the way it looked at me, There was an intelligence there that I can't explain. And the way it was so comfortable in that pitch darkness, while I was struggling to see even with my high beams on, it's like it owned the night. I've driven that stretch of Highway 62 hundreds of times since then, always half expecting to see it again, but I never have. Sometimes I wonder if anyone else has seen it, if it's still out there in those woods. I've heard stories from other drivers about strange things they've seen on night runs, but nothing quite like what I encountered. I know how this sounds. Before that night, if someone had told me this story, I probably wouldn't have believed them. Heck, there are still times I wake up and wonder if it was all just some strange dream. But then I remember the absolute clarity of that moment, the size of the creature, the way it moved, those eyes looking at me, and I know it was real. I'm not asking anyone to believe me. I'm just sharing what happened to me that night. Whatever that thing was, it changed how I see the world. There are things out there we can't explain, things that don't fit into our neat categories of what should and shouldn't exist. I just happened to run into one of them on a dark Texas highway. To this day, whenever I drive through heavily wooded areas at night, I find myself scanning the tree line, wondering if I'll see those eyes again. I still drive trucks, still make night runs, but I've never felt quite the same about those dark, lonely stretches of highway. Some nights, when the darkness is particularly thick and the woods are unusually quiet, I remember that encounter, and my hands tighten on the steering wheel just a little bit more. Story 3. I'd driven that road hundreds of times before. It was a simple 2-lane highway, cutting through dense woods and farmland. The familiar rhythm of my tires on the asphalt usually helped me wind down after work. But that night in early October was different. The air felt heavy, and an unusual fog had settled in patches along the road, making the darkness seem even thicker between the pools of light from my headlamps. I remember having the radio on low, some country station playing Kenny Rogers, I think, when I first noticed something wasn't right. The woods seemed quieter than usual. Living in rural Missouri all my life, you get used to the night sounds, crickets, whip-poor-wills, the occasional hoot of an owl. But that night, there was nothing, just dead silence except for my truck's engine and the radio. I was about 7 miles from home when my headlights caught something in the middle of the road. At first, I thought it was a bear. We'd get them sometimes in the area. But as I got closer, still a good 200 feet away, I realized whatever it was stood upright. And it was tall, really tall. My foot instinctively eased off the gas pedal, and I started slowing down. The figure didn't move. It just stood there, dead center in my lane, facing away from me. That's when I got my first good look at it, and my stomach dropped. The thing was massive, had to be at least 8 feet tall, maybe taller. It was covered in what looked like hair or fur, long and stringy, dark-colored but with a weird grayish tint in my headlights. The hair wasn't matted like you'd expect on a bear. It hung straight down, almost like human hair, but all over its body. I brought my truck to a complete stop about 50 feet away. My hands were sweating on the steering wheel, and my heart was pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat. The creature still hadn't moved an inch. It was like looking at a statue, except I could see the fur moving slightly in the breeze. Looking back, I should have thrown that truck in reverse right then and gotten the hell out of there. But I did what any confused person would do. I flashed my lights. High beams, low beams, high beams again. Nothing. The thing didn't even flinch. It just stood there, this massive silhouette in my headlights, its arms hanging down at its sides. They were long arms, too long, reaching almost to where its knees would be. After what felt like forever, but was probably only a minute or two, I hit the horn. Just a quick tap at first, then a longer blast when nothing happened. The sound echoed through the trees, but the figure remained completely still. It was like it was deaf or in some kind of trance. The whole situation felt wrong. like I was stuck in some kind of nightmare where nothing made sense. That's when things went from weird to terrifying. Without any warning, no turning around, no indication it was about to move, the thing started running straight at my truck. And when I say running, I mean running. 1 second it was standing still, the next it was charging full speed ahead like a linebacker. But the way it moved wasn't right. Its arms didn't pump like a normal runner's would. They stayed stiff at its sides, swinging slightly with each stride. Its legs covered an impossible amount of ground with each step. Pure instinct took over. I stomped on the gas pedal so hard, I'm surprised I didn't put my foot through the floor. My tires spun for a split second before catching, and the truck lurched forward. I yanked the wheel hard to the right, trying to swerve around the thing. I remember the sound of gravel spraying up into my wheel wells as I hit the shoulder. What happened next is still a blur. I felt a thud against the driver's side of the truck as I went past. Not the heavy impact I would have expected from something that size, but more like someone slapping the side of the vehicle. I lost control for a moment, fishtailing on the loose gravel. My front bumper clipped a guardrail before I could straighten out. I didn't stop. I didn't look back. I just kept that pedal floored, flying down that dark highway like the devil himself was chasing me. My hands were shaking so bad I could barely keep the wheel straight. The truck was pulling hard to the right from where I'd hit the guardrail, and there was a new rattling sound coming from somewhere underneath. But I didn't care. I made it home in record time, skidded into my driveway, and sat there with the engine running for a good 10 minutes, just staring at my rearview mirrors. My porch light was on. I always left it on when I worked late, and somehow that normal, everyday sight helped bring me back to reality a bit. When I finally got out to check the damage to my truck, my legs were so wobbly I had to lean against the door for support. The front bumper was bent and scraped up from the guardrail. But what really got me was the driver's side. There were 4 long scrapes in the paint, running from just behind the door all the way to the rear wheel well. They were perfectly parallel, about 4 inches apart, like something with huge fingers had reached out and dragged its hand along the side of my truck as I passed. I called the sheriff's office that night, though I almost didn't. Who was going to believe this? But I knew I had to report the damage to my truck for insurance anyway, and I figured I might as well tell them what happened. The deputy who came out was surprisingly understanding. Turned out I wasn't the only one who'd seen something strange that night. There had been 3 other calls from that same stretch of highway, all describing a large, hairy figure standing in or near the road. They never found anything, no footprints, no hair samples, nothing. The official report just listed it as vandalism to my truck by person or persons unknown. But I know what I saw. Those scrapes on my truck weren't from any person, and that thing in the road wasn't wearing a costume. The way it moved, the impossible speed, the unnatural stillness. Nothing human could have done that. I still live in the area, but I haven't driven that stretch of Route D at night since then. Sold that truck a month later. Couldn't stand looking at those scrapes every day. Some nights, when I'm lying in bed and everything's quiet, I think about how that thing just stood there in the road, completely still, like it was waiting for me, like it knew I was coming. The weirdest part? About a week after it happened, I was changing my truck's oil and found something stuck in the undercarriage. A single long grayish-brown hair, about 8 inches long. It wasn't like any animal hair I'd ever seen. It was coarse but straight, almost like human hair but thicker. I put it in a plastic bag, meaning to take it to the sheriff's office, but it disappeared from my toolbox a couple days later. I still don't know what happened to it. I know how this all sounds. If someone had told me this story back then, I probably wouldn't have believed them. But I know what I saw that night. Sometimes I wish I could explain it away, convince myself it was just a bear or some guy in a costume playing a prank. But deep down, I know better. Whatever that thing was, it wasn't anything that's supposed to exist in our world. and sometimes, late at night, I catch myself wondering if it's still out there, standing perfectly still in the darkness, waiting for the next set of headlights to come along. Story 4. It was early October 2011, around 4:45 a.m. I was driving my old Honda Civic to open up Lamin's restaurant for breakfast service, just like I had done hundreds of times before. Sarah was in the passenger seat. We usually carpooled for these early morning shifts since we lived close to each other. It was pitch black out, with that deep kind of darkness you only get in small Montana towns where there aren't many streetlights. The air was crisp, and there was this light fog hanging low over the ground, typical for that time of year. We were taking our usual route down Highway 200, chatting about normal stuff, weekend plans, gossiping about co-workers. You know how it goes. The headlights were cutting through the fog, and I was driving carefully because deer were common on that stretch. I had my high beams on, scanning the sides of the road like I always did. The creek that runs parallel to that section of highway was running high from the recent rains, and you could hear it rushing even with the windows up. I remember checking the time on my dashboard clock, thinking we were making good time to get everything prepped before our 6 a.m. opening. That's when Sarah suddenly gasped and grabbed my arm. Before I could even ask what was wrong, I saw it too, and my whole body went cold. Something massive stepped out from the creek area on the right side of the road. When I say massive, I mean massive. My first thought was bear, but as soon as that thought formed, I knew it was wrong. This thing was walking on 2 legs, and its proportions were all wrong for a bear. It was at least 8 feet tall, probably taller, with really broad shoulders and long arms that hung down past its knees. I slammed on the brakes instinctively, and the car skidded a little on the damp road. The thing was literally right in front of my car, maybe 5 feet from my bumper. The headlights were illuminating it perfectly, and I still remember every detail, like it's burned into my brain. It was covered in thick, dark brown hair, not patchy or mangy like a sick bear, but dense and uniform. The hair looked wet from crossing the creek, and water was dripping off it. But it was the way it moved that really got to me. It wasn't lumbering or awkward like you'd expect something that big to be. Its movements were smooth and deliberate, almost graceful in a terrifying way. When it turned to look at us, when it turned to look at us, I felt my heart stop. Its face was partially hidden by all that hair, but I could see its eyes reflecting in my headlights. They weren't glowing or red or anything dramatic like that. They were just intelligent, aware, looking right at us with what felt like curiosity or maybe surprise. Time felt like it stopped in that moment. I couldn't move, couldn't speak, couldn't even breathe. Sarah was gripping my arm so hard it left bruises, but I didn't feel it then. The creature held our gaze for what was probably only a few seconds, but felt like an eternity. Then, with shocking agility for something its size, it turned and started climbing up the steep embankment toward Hegan Creek drainage. The way it climbed was unlike anything I'd ever seen. Its long arms helped it navigate the steep slope effortlessly, and despite its size, it moved quickly and quietly. The only sound was some loose dirt and rocks tumbling down the embankment. Within seconds, it had disappeared into the darkness beyond my headlights. Sarah and I sat there in complete silence for what must have been several minutes. My hands were shaking so badly I couldn't take them off the steering wheel. Finally, Sarah whispered, "Did that just happen?" Her voice was trembling, and I could see tears in her eyes when I looked over at her. I managed to nod, but I couldn't find my voice yet. My mind was racing, trying to make sense of what we'd just seen. I've lived in Montana my whole life. I know what bears look like, what moose look like, what elk look like. This wasn't any of those. This wasn't anything I'd ever seen before. Eventually, we had to keep driving. We still had a restaurant to open. The rest of the drive was silent, both of us lost in our thoughts. When we got to Lamin's, we sat in the car for a few more minutes, trying to process what had happened. Finally, Sarah turned to me and said, "We can't tell anyone about this. They'll think we're crazy." I agreed with her then. We went inside and tried to go about our normal routine, but everything felt surreal. I kept replaying the encounter in my mind, trying to find some rational explanation. But there wasn't one. What we saw that morning was real, and it wasn't anything that was supposed to exist. For months afterward, I had trouble sleeping. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw those intelligent eyes looking back at me. I started taking a different route to work, even though it added 15 minutes to my drive. Sarah quit about 2 months later. She said it was for personal reasons, but I know the real reason. She couldn't handle driving that road in the dark anymore. I've spent countless hours researching since then, reading about other sightings in the area. There are more than you'd think, but most people don't talk about them. I understand why now. It's not just the fear of being ridiculed. It's also that once you see something like that, it changes you. It changes how you see the world. You realize that maybe we don't know everything there is to know about what's out there in the wilderness. That section of Highway 200 looks different to me now. Every time I drive past that creek, even in broad daylight, I find myself scanning the tree line. Sometimes I think I see movement in the shadows, or catch a glimpse of something dark moving between the trees. Probably just my imagination playing tricks on me, but maybe not. I still work at Lemons, but I switched to the afternoon shift. I tell people it's because I'm not a morning person anymore, and they believe that. It's easier than telling them the truth. The truth is, I can't handle those pre-dawn drives anymore. Not since that October morning, when everything I thought I knew about the world changed in an instant. I don't expect everyone to believe my story, and that's okay. I probably wouldn't believe it either if I hadn't lived it. But I know what Sarah and I saw that morning was real. Whatever it was, Bigfoot, Sasquatch, or something else entirely, it was there. Just as real as the road we were driving on, or the creek it emerged from. Sometimes I wonder if it's still out there, moving through the forests around Lincoln. I wonder if it remembers us as clearly as we remember it. And sometimes, on particularly quiet nights when the fog rolls in, I think about those eyes looking back at me through the darkness, and I realize that maybe there are some mysteries in this world that are better left unexplained. That's my story. Take from it what you will. But if you ever find yourself driving through Lincoln, Montana, in those early morning hours when the world is still dark and quiet, keep your eyes on the creeks and the tree line. You never know what might be watching you back. Story 5. It was August 15th, 1990. I remember the exact date because I was driving back from a client meeting in Reno to my office in Sacramento. I'd made that drive countless times before. It's basically my second office. The weather was perfect that day, sunny and clear, probably around 75 degrees. I was in my company car, a boring beige Toyota Camry, cruising along I-80 at a steady 65 mph. The time was around 3 p.m., and traffic was surprisingly light for that time of day. I'd just passed the exit for Auburn and was thinking about the pile of paperwork waiting for me back at the office. The radio was playing some forgettable soft rock, and I was absent-mindedly tapping the steering wheel, just another mundane moment in another mundane day. That's when everything changed. About a quarter-mile ahead, I noticed what looked like a person standing on the shoulder of the road. This wasn't unusual. People get flat tires or car trouble all the time. But as I got closer, something felt off. The figure was impossibly tall, and there wasn't any broken-down vehicle in sight. My first thought was that maybe it was someone in costume, though that made no sense in the middle of summer on a highway. But as I got closer, my brain struggled to process what I was seeing. This thing had to be at least 8 feet tall. Its proportions were all wrong for a human being. The shoulders were massive, probably twice the width of a normal person's. I instinctively eased off the gas, slowing down to maybe 45 mph. That's when it started moving. The creature stepped onto the highway with a strange, fluid motion that made my skin crawl. It wasn't the way a person in a costume would move. The movement was too natural, too organic. Its arms were incredibly long, hanging down past its knees, and they swung with an unsettling grace as it walked. The thing that struck me most was its skin, or rather, its covering. It wasn't the thick fur you see in those typical Bigfoot pictures. Instead, it had patches of dark, almost black hair covering parts of its body, but you could see skin underneath in places. The hair was longer on its head, hanging in matted strands over its shoulders. It reminded me of very coarse human hair, but dirty and tangled. By this point, I was probably about 200 feet away, and I had slowed to around 30 mph. There was a semi-truck about a quarter-mile behind me, but otherwise the highway was empty. The creature was crossing from the eastbound shoulder toward the median, moving with purposeful strides. The sunlight was hitting it directly, and I could see everything in horrifying detail. Its face. God, its face. It wasn't ape-like, but it wasn't human either. The features were somewhere in between, with a prominent brow ridge and a wide, flat nose. But the eyes, they were undeniably intelligent, dark and deep-set, but aware, conscious. As it crossed into my lane, I had to make a decision, swerve or brake harder. I chose to brake, my heart pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat. The creature turned its head to look at me, and in that moment, time seemed to slow down. Our eyes met, and I felt a primal fear unlike anything I've ever experienced. This wasn't just fear of the unknown. It was recognition of something that shouldn't exist, something that challenged everything I thought I knew about the world. The creature's gait never faltered. It continued across the lanes with that same fluid stride, but its head remained turned toward me until it passed directly in front of my car. I was close enough now to see the muscles moving under its skin, to notice how its joints bent slightly differently than a human's. The hair on its body had a slight sheen in the sunlight, and I could see it moving in the wind. As it passed in front of my car, I noticed other details that have stayed with me. Its hands were massive, easily twice the size of mine, with long fingers that looked surprisingly dexterous. Its skin, where visible, was a grayish-brown color, almost like weathered leather. There was dirt caked on its feet and lower legs, and what looked like old scars on its arms. The whole crossing probably took less than 30 seconds, but it felt like hours. The creature reached the median and, without hesitation, jumped over the concrete barrier separating the eastbound and westbound lanes. The barrier had to be at least 4 feet high, but it cleared it effortlessly, like someone stepping over a curb. I brought my car to a complete stop, watching as it disappeared down the embankment on the other side of the westbound lanes. The semi-truck that had been behind me roared past, its driver probably wondering why I was stopped in the middle of the highway. But I couldn't move. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely grip the steering wheel. After what felt like several minutes, I managed to pull over to the shoulder. I sat there for maybe 20 minutes, trying to process what I'd just seen. I kept expecting other cars to stop, other witnesses to emerge, but traffic continued to flow normally. It was as if nothing extraordinary had happened. I eventually got out of my car on shaky legs and walked to the median barrier. The concrete was old and weathered, but there in the dust I saw something that made my blood run cold. A single massive footprint, easily 18 inches long, pressed into the dirt beside the barrier. The impression was deep, suggesting whatever made it was incredibly heavy. I didn't have a camera with me. This was 1990, remember, before everyone had phones with cameras. I didn't even think to try to measure the footprint or preserve it somehow. I was in shock, operating on autopilot. All I could do was stare at it, trying to convince myself that what I'd seen was real. After a while, I got back in my car and drove to Sacramento. I was late getting back to the office, but I couldn't bring myself to tell anyone what had happened. Who would believe me? I was having trouble believing it myself. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw those intelligent, dark eyes staring back at me. I kept replaying the encounter in my mind, analyzing every detail, trying to find some rational explanation. But there wasn't one. What I saw that day was real. Over the years, I've thought about coming forward with this story many times. I've read other accounts of Bigfoot sightings, but most of them are in remote areas, at night, with poor visibility. Mine happened in broad daylight, on one of the busiest highways in California. The creature showed no fear, no hesitation. It was like watching someone cross the street to catch a bus, just a purposeful journey from point A to point B. I've driven that stretch of I-80 hundreds of times since then, always scanning the shoulders and medians, always wondering if I'll see it again. I never have. Sometimes I wonder if maybe that's for the best. Some things in this world aren't meant to be understood or explained. They just are. The strangest part, in all these years I've never seen another report of a Bigfoot sighting on I-80 that matches what I saw. You'd think something that bold, crossing a major highway in daylight, would have been seen by others. But if they have seen it, they've kept quiet, just like I did for so long. I'm sharing this now because I'm older, and I've come to terms with the fact that I may never understand what I saw that day. But I know what I saw. It was real, it was there, and it changed my understanding of what's possible in this world. The creature was not just real, it was aware, intelligent, and completely unafraid. And that, perhaps, is the most unsettling part of all. Every time I hear someone dismiss Bigfoot stories as hoaxes or imagination, I think about that moment when our eyes met on the highway. There was something ancient in those eyes, something that knew far more about this world than we do. And sometimes, late at night when I can't sleep, I wonder, was it really crossing my path that day? Or was I crossing its path on a road that we humans built through its territory? I still work in insurance. I still deal in facts and evidence every day. But I know now that some things exist beyond the realm of what we can prove or explain. That knowledge has been both a burden and a strange kind of gift. I don't expect anyone to believe this story, but I needed to tell it. It's part of who I am now. This memory of an impossible encounter on an ordinary afternoon in 1990. Story 6. It was around 11:30 p.m. when I left work. The snow had been coming down hard for hours, and the roads were getting worse by the minute. I remember gripping the steering wheel of my old Ford pickup, trying to keep it steady on I-40 as the wind pushed against the truck. The headlights could barely cut through the swirling snow, and there weren't many other cars on the road, just the occasional semi pushing through the storm. I had the heater cranked up and the radio on low, just trying to stay alert. You know how it is when you're driving in bad weather. Every sense is heightened, and you're scanning constantly for any sign of danger. The snow was starting to stick to the road, making that weird crunching sound under the tires that tells you it's freezing. I'd slowed down to about 45 mph, which is unusually slow for that stretch, but I didn't want to risk sliding off the road. Just past Thoreau, where the highway cuts through some pretty desolate territory, I noticed something moving on the shoulder of the road. At first, I thought it was just snow being whipped up by the wind. You see a lot of that during storms out here. But as I got closer, I could make out a distinct shape. My first thought was that some poor soul's car had broken down, and they were trying to walk to safety in this weather. That happens sometimes out here, though it's incredibly dangerous in these conditions. I started to slow down even more, thinking I might need to help whoever it was. That's when I realized something was very wrong. What I was seeing wasn't just tall, it was massive. As my headlights illuminated the figure more clearly, I felt my stomach drop. This thing had to be at least 7 feet tall, probably more, and it wasn't wearing clothes. Its entire body was covered in long, shaggy brown hair that was being whipped around by the wind. I know how crazy this sounds. Trust me, I've replayed this moment in my head thousands of times over the years, trying to convince myself I was just tired or that the snow was playing tricks on my eyes. But what I saw next is burned into my memory forever. The creature turned toward my truck as I approached. The way it moved wasn't like anything I've ever seen, fluid and powerful, like an athlete, but with an almost casual confidence that made my skin crawl. Its arms were incredibly long, hanging down past its knees, and I could see muscles rippling under all that hair, even through the snow. But it was the face that really got to me. God, that face. Under a pronounced brow ridge, 2 dark eyes reflected my headlights, and they weren't animal eyes. There was intelligence there, and something else. The best way I can describe it is like looking at an old warrior who's seen too much combat. The face had this weathered, almost ancient quality to it, with patches of shorter, greyish hair around the head that stood out against the darker brown of its body. And the expression, it wasn't just angry, it was contemptuous, like I was trespassing on its territory, and it wanted me to know it. I've done enough hunting to be able to estimate an animal's weight pretty well, and this thing had to be at least 400 pounds, probably more. It had this massive barrel chest and shoulders that would make a linebacker look small. The snow was really coming down at this point, but I could see it clearly enough to know that this wasn't a person in a suit. The way the hair moved in the wind, the steam coming from its breath in the cold air, it was all too real. For what felt like an eternity, but was probably only a few seconds, we just looked at each other. I had slowed down to maybe 20 mph at this point, partly from shock and partly because of the road conditions. The creature took a step toward the highway, and that's when pure survival instinct kicked in. I pressed the gas pedal hard. My tires spun for a moment on the snow before finding grip, and the truck lurched forward. In my rearview mirror, I could see the figure standing in the road, watching me drive away. It didn't chase me or make any aggressive moves. It just stood there, getting smaller and smaller until it disappeared in the swirling snow. But I swear I could feel those eyes on me long after I'd lost sight of it. I didn't stop driving until I got home, even though my hands were shaking so bad I could barely keep the truck on the road. I didn't report it to anyone. Who would believe me? A 7-foot-tall, hairy humanoid standing on the side of I-40 during a snowstorm. I'd sound crazy. But I know what I saw. The thing that really haunts me isn't just how it looked, but how it made me feel. There was this overwhelming sense of age about it. Like I was looking at something that had been walking these lands long before the highways were built, before the towns were here, maybe even before people were here. And it knew it belonged here more than we did. I still make that drive every workday, but I never saw anything like that again. Sometimes when the snow is falling and visibility gets bad, I catch myself scanning the shoulders of the road, half expecting to see that figure emerge from the darkness. The rational part of my brain tries to explain it away, stress, fatigue, weather conditions playing tricks on my mind. But deep down, I know what I saw that night was real. The weird thing is, after it happened, I started hearing other stories from people in the area. Truckers who've seen similar things on that stretch of highway, especially during bad weather. Hunters who've found strange tracks in the snow up in the mountains. Everyone's hesitant to talk about it openly, but after a few beers, the stories come out. And they're all surprisingly similar to what I experienced. I've never been able to explain what I saw that night, and honestly, I'm not sure I want to. Some things are better left as mysteries, but I know this. Whatever that creature was, it was intelligent, it was powerful, and it was absolutely real. And somewhere out there in the wilderness of New Mexico, It's still walking through the snow, watching us pass through its territory with those ancient, knowing eyes. The whole experience changed how I see the world. When people talk about Bigfoot sightings or other unexplained phenomena, I don't laugh anymore. There are things out there we don't understand, things that don't fit into our neat categories of what's supposed to be real and what isn't. I just count myself lucky that whatever I encountered that night didn't decide to do anything more than watch me drive by. These days, whenever there's a snowstorm, I take the longer route home that stays closer to town. It adds an extra 20 minutes to my commute, but that's a small price to pay for peace of mind. Because the truth is, I'm not entirely sure what I would do if I ever saw that creature again. Part of me wants proof, a photo or a video that would validate what I experienced. But a bigger part of me is content to leave that encounter as it is. An unexplainable moment that reminds me just how mysterious our world really is. Story 7. I've been hesitating to write this down for so long. Even now, 74 years later, my hands shake a bit when I think about what I saw that night in New Mexico. I found my grandfather Horace's old diary last month while cleaning out my parents' house, and reading his account brought it all flooding back. I guess it's finally time to share what happened to me that winter. It was January 1950, and I'd just started working as a locomotive engineer for Rock Island Railroad, following in my grandfather's footsteps. The job was everything I'd dreamed of, even with the long hours and harsh weather conditions. That particular night, I was running the late freight route from Amarillo to Tucumcari. The weather forecast had warned of snow, but none of us expected the blizzard that hit. The storm came in fast and fierce around 11 p.m. The wind was howling so loud it drowned out the engine noise, which is saying something if you know anything about those old diesel locomotives. The snow was coming down in thick, heavy sheets, and visibility was maybe 20 feet at best with our headlight. Standard procedure was to reduce speed in these conditions, but we still had to keep moving. The railroad didn't stop for weather. Schedules had to be kept. My fireman, Jim, was supposed to be helping me watch the tracks, but he'd dozed off about an hour earlier. I didn't wake him. Poor guy had pulled a double shift the day before. Besides, with visibility this bad, an extra pair of eyes wouldn't have made much difference. I just focused on watching the tracks ahead, fighting the monotony and the hypnotic effect of the snowflakes in the headlight beam. We were about 15 miles outside of Tucumcari when I first noticed something wasn't right. The snow was swirling in strange patterns near the tracks, like something was disrupting the airflow. At first, I thought it might be some tumbleweeds caught in the wind, but the shapes seemed too solid, too deliberate in their movement. As we got closer, I made out what looked like a group of people walking along the tracks. My first thought was the same as my grandfather's. They had to be Native Americans from one of the local tribes, probably caught in the storm. I reached for the whistle cord to warn them we were coming, but something made me hesitate. The way they were moving, it wasn't right. They were way too comfortable in the blizzard, walking upright and steady despite the fierce wind that was rocking my 150-ton locomotive. The headlight caught them fully about 100 yards ahead. I counted 7 figures. They were walking in a loose line along the right side of the tracks, all heading the same direction we were. What I'd initially thought were blankets or heavy coats wasn't. Even now, I'm struggling to describe exactly what I saw. Their bodies were covered in thick, dark hair, not like fur on a bear or a buffalo, but long and almost matted, especially around their shoulders and back. The hair hung down past their waists, and I could see it was crudely braided or twisted into rough ropes in places. They were huge. I'd guess the smallest one was at least 7 feet tall, with the largest maybe pushing 8 feet. Their bodies were massive, not fat, but broad and powerful looking. They walked fully upright, just like humans, but their arms were longer, hanging down almost to their knees. I knew I should slow down more or stop completely. These beings were dangerously close to the tracks, but something primitive in my brain took over, some instinct telling me that stopping would be the worst thing I could do. I kept the engine at steady speed, gripping the controls so tight my knuckles were white. As we drew alongside them, one of them turned to look at the train. The light caught its face for just a split second, but that image is burned into my memory forever. The face was almost human, but wrong in subtle ways that made it terrifying. The brow ridge was massive, shadowing deep-set eyes that reflected the light like a cat's. The nose was wide and flat, and the jaw was incredibly powerful looking. But it was the eyes that really got to me. There was intelligence there, not animal awareness, but real, thinking intelligence. And something else I couldn't identify. The creature's gaze met mine through the cab window. I swear it nodded slightly, like it was acknowledging me. Then it made a sound, not quite a whistle, not quite a call, and the whole group moved further from the tracks in perfect unison, still maintaining their steady pace. I watched in the side mirror as we passed them, half expecting them to try to grab onto the train or change direction to follow us. But they just kept walking, disappearing into the snow like they'd never been there at all. The whole encounter probably lasted less than a minute. Jim slept through the whole thing. When he woke up as we were pulling into Tucumcari, I couldn't bring myself to tell him what I'd seen. Who would believe it? A group of giant, hair-covered humanoids calmly strolling through a blizzard like they were taking a Sunday walk in the park. I filed my routine report for that night's run, but left out any mention of the encounter. The next day, I carefully checked the local papers for any unusual sightings or incidents along that stretch of track. Nothing. I even drove back out there when the storm cleared, looking for footprints or any other signs. The snow had drifted too deep, covering any evidence that might have been there. Over the years, I ran that route hundreds more times. I always paid special attention to that stretch of track, especially during winter storms. I never saw them again. Sometimes I've wondered if the whole thing was some kind of hallucination brought on by fatigue and the hypnotic effect of the snow. But then I found my grandfather's diary, and reading his account from that same stretch of track, the details match too perfectly for it to be coincidence. The thing that still haunts me isn't the creature's appearance, as frightening as it was. It's the sense of purpose they had. They weren't just wandering aimlessly or hunting. They were traveling somewhere specific, following the railroad tracks like they were using them as a navigation aid. Sometimes I wonder how long they'd been using those tracks as their pathway, how many other engineers might have seen them over the years and, like me, kept quiet about it. I'm an old man now, and I've had a lot of time to think about what I saw that night. I've read about similar sightings in that part of the country. People call them Bigfoot these days, but what I saw wasn't some solitary beast in the woods. This was a group moving with purpose, using human infrastructure for their own needs. They were intelligent enough to understand what the railroad was for, smart enough to keep their distance from the train when it passed. That suggests a level of sophistication that's far beyond what most people imagine when they think about Bigfoot. I've never told this story before. My wife passed last year, and my kids are grown with families of their own. Maybe that's why I finally feel like I can share it now. I don't expect anyone to believe me, but I know what I saw. Those creatures were real, and they're still out there somewhere, using our roads and railways like ancient paths through their territory. The really unsettling thing, those tracks I saw them on that night, they could have followed them all the way to Chicago if they wanted to. Makes you wonder where they were going and if they ever made it there. Every time I hear about a strange sighting near a railroad line, I think about those 7 figures in the snow, and I wonder if it's the same group, still out there, still traveling to some destination only they know. Story 8. I've never been able to shake what happened that night in 1975. Even now, decades later, my hands start trembling when I think about it. I was 34 then, recently divorced, and had my two boys, Tommy, 11, and Jack, 9, for the weekend. We'd converted my old Ford pickup into a makeshift camper. Nothing fancy, just some plywood and a foam mattress in the back with a tarp cover. The boys loved it, called it our adventure mobile. That Friday evening, we'd driven out to this quiet spot near Russell, Massachusetts. I knew the area well, used to hunt there in my 20s. There was this clearing about half a mile off Route 20, surrounded by thick woods. Perfect spot to park overnight and do some stargazing with the boys. Tommy had just gotten interested in astronomy, so I'd borrowed a pair of binoculars from work. The excitement on their faces when we spotted Jupiter that night. God, I wish we'd just gone home after that. It must have been around 11 p.m. when everything went sideways. The boys had dozed off in their sleeping bags, and I was just about to turn in myself. You know that feeling when you're drifting off, but something keeps you awake, like your brain is trying to warn you. That's exactly how I felt. The air had gotten unusually still. No crickets, no rustling leaves, nothing. Just dead silence. Then the truck started moving. Not like when someone bumps into it, but a deliberate rocking motion. At first, I thought maybe it was Tommy or Jack shifting around, but this was different. The whole vehicle was swaying from side to side. My first thought was bears. We'd had issues with them in the area before. I reached for the flashlight I always kept by my pillow, trying not to wake the boys. That's when I heard it. This deep, guttural breathing right outside the driver's side door. It wasn't a bear. Bears don't breathe like that. This sound, it was almost human, but not quite. Lower, more powerful. I could feel the vibration of it through the truck's frame. I knew I had to check it out. My boys were in there, for Christ's sake. I slowly opened the door, flashlight gripped tight in my right hand. The moment my foot hit the running board, everything happened so fast. This massive hand, I say hand, but it was more like a huge hair-covered paw, grabbed my left shoulder. The strength was unreal. I'm not a small guy, worked construction all my life, but this thing lifted me off the running board like I was nothing. The flashlight beam caught it for just a split second before I dropped it. 7 feet tall if it was an inch, covered in this light brownish-yellow hair. The face, Jesus, the face. It was like a cross between a man and an ape, but different from any ape I'd ever seen. The eyes reflected my flashlight, 2 orange-red circles in the darkness. But it was the smell that really got to me, like wet dog mixed with something rotten, so strong it made my eyes water. It shoved me backward, and I hit the ground hard enough to knock the wind out of me. I could hear the boys starting to wake up, confused and scared. The thing turned its head toward their voices, and that's when pure terror kicked in. I scrambled to my feet, ready to do whatever it took to protect my kids. But then something strange happened. Instead of attacking, it just stood there, staring at me. The weirdest part? It seemed almost as startled as I was. For what felt like forever, we just looked at each other. Then it made this sound, not quite a growl, not quite a grunt, and backed away into the trees. The whole thing couldn't have lasted more than a minute. I grabbed the boys, and we got the hell out of there, didn't even pack up our stuff. The entire drive home, Tommy kept saying he saw it watching us from the trees, but I was too focused on getting us back to civilization to look. Jack was dead quiet, which wasn't like him at all. The next day, I reported it to the local police. They probably thought I was crazy or drunk, but they took the report anyway. That's when Dr. Kuhn from Harvard got involved. He was different from the others. He actually listened, made us take lie detector tests, which we passed. He found these massive footprints at the site, took plaster casts and everything, measured the dents in the truck's body where it had grabbed it, told me the force needed to make those marks was extraordinary. But here's the thing that still haunts me. Those eyes. They weren't animal eyes, not really. There was something else there, something almost intelligent, like it was studying me just as much as I was studying it. Sometimes I wonder if that's why it backed off. It saw the boys and recognized we were a family. I've never gone camping again. The boys are grown now with kids of their own, but they still won't go into the woods at night. Tommy became obsessed with cryptozoology for a while, trying to make sense of what happened. Jack refuses to talk about it at all. Dr. Kuhn interviewed us several times over the next few months, but eventually the investigation just fizzled out. Like these things always do. No concrete answers, just more questions. The marks on my shoulder took weeks to fade, 5 distinct bruises where those fingers had gripped me. I kept expecting something to come of it all, some big scientific discovery or explanation, but nothing ever did. That clearing's still there. I checked on Google Maps recently. Looks exactly the same as it did back then. Sometimes I think about going back, just to prove to myself that I'm not crazy. But then I remember those eyes, that smell, and that inhuman strength, and I know I never will. I don't expect anyone to believe me. Hell, sometimes I'm not sure I believe it myself. But I know what I saw that night, what I felt, what my boys saw. And I know that somewhere out there in the woods of Massachusetts, there's something that defies explanation. Something that, for whatever reason, let us go that night. The worst part? Every time I hear about another sighting in those woods, I get this feeling in my gut. Like maybe it's still out there, watching, waiting, and maybe next time it won't just walk away. Story 9. My family has owned this beautiful piece of land in Eagle, Idaho for generations. It's about 80 acres of pristine wilderness, mostly dense forest with some clearings, perfect for hunting. Every fall, my dad and I would spend the hunting season there. We had this simple but cozy cabin that my grandfather built in the 60s, and we knew every trail and tree on that property. At least we thought we did until that year. The strange events started during the first week of the season. My wife Sarah had joined us that year. It was her first time hunting, and she was really excited about it. We had 3 hunting stands set up across the property. Dad took the one near the creek. Sarah chose the newer stand we'd built that spring about half a mile east of the cabin, and I was in the old reliable stand near the northern property line. That morning started like any other. We got up before dawn, had our usual breakfast of instant coffee and oatmeal, and headed out to our stands while it was still dark. The sunrise was beautiful that day. I remember because it would be the last normal moment we'd experience. Around 9 a.m. something happened that I still can't explain. You know how the forest is always alive with sound? Birds chirping, squirrels rustling through leaves, wind in the trees. It's never truly silent. But suddenly, everything just stopped. The silence was so absolute, it felt like someone had pressed a mute button on the world. Even the wind seemed to die. I've been hunting for over 40 years, and I've never experienced anything like it. My skin started crawling, and the hair on the back of my neck stood up. That's when I heard it. A massive crack that echoed through the silent forest, followed by the thunderous crash of a falling tree. This wasn't unusual by itself. Trees fall in forests all the time. But what made my blood run cold was what came after. There was this sound. God, I don't even know how to describe it. It was like a cross between a deep growl and a rumble, but not quite either. It seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once, and it was unlike anything I'd ever heard any known animal make. I tried to radio Dad and Sarah, but got no response from either of them. The radios were working fine the day before, and we'd changed the batteries that morning. I spent another hour in that stand, every muscle tense, straining to hear anything in that unnatural silence. Finally, I couldn't take it anymore and headed back to the cabin. Dad was already there, looking shaken. He'd heard the silence and the tree falling too, but from his position he'd also heard heavy footsteps, way too heavy to be a deer or even a bear, moving through the underbrush. We waited anxiously for Sarah to return. When she finally came back around noon, she was pale as a sheet and shaking. It took us 20 minutes to calm her down enough to tell us what happened. She'd been in her stand, reading a book during a quiet period, when she felt something behind her. Not heard, felt. Like when you know someone's staring at you. When she turned around, she says she saw something massive moving through the trees about 30 yards away. Whatever it was tall enough that its head was level with her stand, and her stand was 15 feet off the ground. She said it had reddish-brown hair, kind of like an Irish setter's coat, but more matted and uneven. When it noticed her looking, it moved away so quickly and quietly that she could hardly believe something that big could move that fast. She immediately climbed down and ran back to the cabin. We spent the rest of that day in the cabin trying to rationalize what had happened. Maybe it was just a bear. Maybe the silence was just our imagination. Maybe Sarah had seen a moose. They can be pretty tall. But deep down, we all knew none of those explanations fit what we'd experienced. The next few weeks were relatively normal, though none of us could shake that feeling of being watched. We'd hear occasional strange noises at night, not quite footsteps, but something heavy moving around the cabin. Sometimes we'd find our trash cans knocked over in the morning, but not torn apart like a bear would do, just carefully tipped over, with specific items missing, mostly our food waste. Then came the last week of the season. I'll never forget that day as long as I live. I was in my stand again, and it was late afternoon. The sun was starting to set, creating long shadows through the trees. That's when the silence fell again, just like that first day. This time, I knew what it meant, and my heart started racing. I heard movement to my left, slow and deliberate. When I turned to look, my entire world shifted on its axis. There it was, not 50 yards away, standing in a small clearing. It was enormous. I'm 6'2", and this thing had to be at least 7 feet tall. Its arms were incredibly long and thick, hanging down past its knees. The chest was massive, barrel-shaped, covered in that same reddish hair Sarah had described, but I could now see that it was thinner on the arms and face. But it was the face that really got to me. It looked almost human, but not quite. The features were all wrong, too big, too flat, too ancient somehow. And its eyes. They weren't animal eyes. There was intelligence there, awareness. It was looking right at me, and I knew it knew that I saw it. We stared at each other for what felt like hours, but was probably only a few seconds. Then, without making a sound, it turned and walked into the trees. Not ran, not hurried, just calmly walked away. Its gait was smooth but odd, like its knees bent differently than ours. I sat in that stand until it was almost completely dark, afraid to move. When I finally got back to the cabin, I couldn't even talk about what I'd seen. We packed up the next day and left 2 weeks earlier than planned. Dad sold the property the following year, said he was getting too old for hunting, but I know the real reason. I've spent countless hours since then researching similar encounters, trying to make sense of what we experienced. I've read about Bigfoot sightings, of course, but none of the common descriptions quite match what I saw. The reddish color was unusual, and most reports described them as being more aggressive, or at least more active. This thing seemed deliberate, intelligent, like it was studying us as much as we were afraid of it. We've never gone back to that property. Dad passed away last year, and in all the years between, we only talked about it once. He admitted that he'd seen it too, that last week, but from much further away. Sarah refuses to discuss it at all. I know how this sounds. Believe me, if someone had told me this story before it happened, I would have thought they were crazy or lying. Sometimes I wonder if I imagined it all, but then I remember that absolute silence, those intelligent eyes, and that impossible reddish figure walking away through the trees, and I know it was real. I don't expect anyone to believe this story. Hell, I'm not sure I would believe it if I hadn't lived it. But I know what I saw, what we all experienced. Whatever it was real, and it was there on our property in Eagle, Idaho, during that hunting season in 1989. Sometimes I wonder if it's still there, watching other hunters from the shadows of those woods. Story 10. I was stationed at Naval Hospital Bremerton in Washington State back in '98, working as a medical officer. Being from the East Coast originally, I was completely blown away by the Pacific Northwest's wilderness. Every chance I got, I'd go hiking or camping in the Olympic National Forest. I'd done plenty of solo camping before, but what happened that night in bear camp changed everything for me. It was early October, and I had a rare 3-day weekend. The weather forecast looked decent, typical PNW overcast, but no rain predicted. I figured it was probably one of the last chances I'd get to camp before winter set in. I'd been to bear camp a few times before. Nothing extraordinary had ever happened. Just your usual peaceful camping experience. I packed light, just my basic gear, some MREs, old habits die hard, and my trusty sleeping bag rated for 20-degree Celsius. The drive from Bremerton took about 2 hours. I remember checking my watch when I parked at the trailhead. It was around 2 p.m. The parking lot was empty, which wasn't unusual for a Thursday. The tourist season was over, and most locals were probably at work. The hike-in was uneventful. There was this crisp autumn smell in the air, that mix of damp earth and dying leaves. The trail was well maintained, though there were lots of fallen leaves covering it. I kept a steady pace, wanting to set up camp before dusk. The whole time I had this weird feeling, not exactly unease, just awareness, like when you're on watch duty and everything seems normal, but your training keeps you alert anyway. I reached bear camp around 4:30 p.m. The campsite was exactly how I remembered it, this beautiful clearing surrounded by massive Douglas firs. These trees were ancient, their trunks wider than my car. I found a nice spot between two of them, about 50 yards from where the clearing opened up into a meadow. The ground was relatively flat there, and the trees provided good shelter from the wind. Setting up camp was routine. I had this lightweight 2-person tent, overkill for solo camping, but I liked the extra space. I gathered some firewood, set up my camp stove, and had one of my MREs for dinner. Beef stew, not great, not terrible. By the time I finished eating and cleaning up, the sun was setting. The temperature was dropping pretty quickly, so I got a small fire going. This is where things started getting different. Usually, when night falls in the forest, you get this chorus of sounds, owls, small animals rustling in the underbrush, that sort of thing. But that evening, everything seemed muted. I didn't think much of it at first. Sometimes the wildlife just isn't active. I sat by the fire for a while, reading this paperback thriller I'd brought along. Around 10 p.m. I doused the fire and turned in. I'm usually a pretty light sleeper, military training and all that. But I must have been more tired than I thought because I fell asleep quickly. What woke me up? God, even now typing this makes my hands shake a bit. It was this sound, footsteps, heavy footsteps. Not like a deer or even a bear. These were bipedal steps, slow and deliberate, and they were close, maybe 8 to 10 feet from my tent. My first thought was that another hiker had gotten lost and was wandering through the campsite. But something in my gut told me this wasn't human. The steps were too heavy, too spread apart. Each one made this soft thud that I could feel through the ground. I lay there, completely still, trying to control my breathing. Military training kicks in during moments like these. Stay quiet, assess the situation, don't make any sudden moves. The footsteps circled my tent, moving at this eerily steady pace. I could hear whatever it was breathing, these deep, rhythmic breaths that sounded wrong. Not like any animal I'd encountered before, and I'd run into my fair share of bears and elk during my time in Washington. Then it stopped, right at the edge of the campsite, where the trees met the clearing. There was this moment of complete silence that felt like it lasted forever. Then, this sound. I've spent hours trying to figure out how to describe it accurately. It wasn't a growl, wasn't a roar. It was this deep, guttural vocalization that started low and rose in pitch. The closest thing I can compare it to is a whale song, but rougher, more primal. And the most terrifying part. Something answered from across the meadow. I'm not ashamed to admit I was scared out of my mind. I've been through military training, dealt with emergency situations in the hospital, but nothing prepared me for this. The creature, and I'm convinced it was something I can't explain, started circling the camp again. This time it was marking its territory or something because I could smell this intense, musky odor. It was like wet dog mixed with something rotting, but stronger than anything I'd ever encountered. This went on for what felt like hours, but was probably about 45 minutes according to my watch. The walking, the stopping, those calls being answered from the distance. Each time it called, the response seemed closer. I lay there in my sleeping bag, my K-bar knife clutched in one hand, fat lot of good that would have done, trying to make myself as small and quiet as possible. Then something changed. The footsteps stopped again, but this time I heard movement in the trees above me. These weren't small branches breaking, these were substantial limbs bending and creaking under serious weight. Whatever this thing was, it was massive enough to make those huge Douglas firs sway. The smell got overwhelming at this point, so strong it made my eyes water. I could hear it breathing right above my tent, and then, this is the part that still haunts me, it made this sound that was almost like speech. Not words exactly, but something more complex than animal noises. 3 distinct vocalizations, followed by a response from the meadow that mimicked the same pattern. Suddenly, everything went quiet. The breathing stopped, the movement in the trees ceased, and that oppressive smell gradually faded. I stayed absolutely still for at least another hour, straining to hear any sign of the creature's return. Nothing. Just the normal sounds of the forest slowly returning, an owl hooting, small animals rustling in the underbrush. I waited until the first light of dawn before I even thought about moving. When I finally got up the courage to unzip my tent, my hands were shaking so badly I could barely manage the zipper. The campsite looked normal at first glance, but then I noticed the details. The ground around my tent was marked with these massive indentations, footprints, I guess you'd call them, though they were like no prints I'd ever seen. They were huge, maybe 16 to 17 inches long, and deeply pressed into the soil. There was a clear circle pattern where the creature had walked around my camp. But the really strange thing, those massive Douglas firs I'd camped between, their branches were broken at least 15 feet up, snapped clean off in some places. The breaks were fresh. I could smell the sap. Whatever had been there was tall enough to reach branches that I'd need a ladder to touch. I packed up my gear in record time. Didn't even bother with breakfast or properly breaking down camp. Just shoved everything in my backpack and got out of there. The hike back to my car was a blur. I kept looking over my shoulder, convinced I was being watched. The forest felt different, oppressive, like the trees themselves were closing in around me. I made it back to my car around 7 a.m. My hands were shaking so badly I dropped my keys twice before I could unlock the door. As I was throwing my pack in the back seat, I heard it one last time, that same 3-part vocalization coming from deep in the forest. I got in my car and drove straight back to base. I never reported it officially. What would I say? That something that shouldn't exist stalked my campsite all night? That I heard sounds that couldn't come from any known animal? I was a medical officer. I had a reputation to maintain. But I did do some research afterward. Spent countless hours reading about similar encounters in the Olympic Peninsula. Found out that area had a history of strange sightings going back to the Native American tribes who first lived there. That was my last solo camping trip. These days, if I go into the backcountry at all, I make sure I'm with a group. I've tried to rationalize what happened that night. Maybe it was a bear. Maybe my mind was playing tricks on me. But deep down, I know what I experienced was real. Something was out there in those woods. Something that shouldn't exist but does. The really unsettling part. Sometimes, late at night when I can't sleep, I wonder if it was trying to communicate something. Those three-part calls, the way they were answered, it felt deliberate, purposeful, like there was intelligence behind it. But that's the thing that scares me the most. The idea that there might be something out there in our forests that's not just some animal, but something that thinks, that plans, that communicates. I still live in Washington, but I stick to the coast these days. The Olympics are beautiful, but they hold secrets that I'm not eager to encounter again. Sometimes when I look at those mountains in the distance, I remember that night, and I swear I can still smell that musky odor, still feel those footsteps shaking the ground. Whatever it was, it let me go that night. I don't think I want to push my luck with a second encounter. Story 11. It was the summer of 2008, and I was beyond excited about my first overnight scout camp. My parents had finally agreed I was old enough to go, and I'd been counting down the days for weeks. The camp was nestled in a wooded area just outside Redding, California. There were about 20 of us girls spread across several cabins, with 2 troop leaders staying in a separate cabin nearby. My cabin was the furthest from the main lodge, right at the edge of the woods. At the time, I thought this was the coolest thing ever, being closer to nature and all that. Looking back now, I wish I'd been assigned literally any other cabin. The first day went exactly how you'd expect a scout camp to go. We did arts and crafts, learned about wilderness survival, practiced knot tying, and had s'mores around the campfire. Everything was perfect until that first night. That's when things started getting weird. I remember lying in my bunk, trying to fall asleep despite being excited about the next day's activities. My cabin mate Sarah was already fast asleep in the bunk below me. I'd won the top bunk in a coin toss. It must have been around 10:30 p.m. when I first heard it. A scratching sound coming from the exterior wall, right next to my bunk. At first I tried to rationalize it. Growing up in California, I was used to trees scraping against windows and walls during windy nights. But as I laid there listening, I realized something that made my stomach drop. There wasn't any wind, none. The trees outside were completely still, and the night was dead quiet except for that scratching. The sound would start and stop randomly. Sometimes it was gentle, almost like someone running their fingernails lightly across the wooden walls. Other times it was deeper, more deliberate, like something was trying to gauge the strength of the wall. I pulled my sleeping bag up to my chin and tried to convince myself it was just a raccoon or maybe a bear, even though we'd been told there hadn't been any bear sightings in the area for years. I wanted to wake Sarah up, but I was frozen in place. The scratching continued for what felt like hours, moving from one spot to another along the wall. Eventually it stopped, and I must have fallen asleep from sheer exhaustion. The next morning, I checked the exterior wall, but couldn't find any obvious scratch marks. When I mentioned the sounds to our troop leader, Ms. Thompson, she suggested it was probably just a curious raccoon and reminded me that we were perfectly safe in our cabins. I wanted to believe her, but something in my gut told me this wasn't just some raccoon. That second night, I couldn't sleep. The memory of those scratching sounds kept me wide awake, and I was terrified they would start again. Around 9:45 p.m., I heard Sarah's breathing become slow and regular, signaling she was asleep. The cabin was dark except for the moonlight filtering through our single window. Then it started again. The same scratching sounds, but this time they were accompanied by something new, a deep, musty smell that seemed to seep through the walls. It reminded me of wet dog mixed with something earthier, almost like rotting leaves. The smell was so strong it made my eyes water. I knew I should just stay in my bunk and try to sleep, but I couldn't help myself. I had to know what was out there. Moving as quietly as I could, I climbed down from my bunk and crept toward the window. The scratching sound stopped as soon as my feet hit the floor. I stood there for what felt like forever, my heart pounding so hard I was sure whatever was out there could hear it. The moon was nearly full that night, casting long shadows across the ground outside. At first, I didn't see anything unusual, just trees, bushes, and the normal shadows you'd expect. Then something moved. It wasn't a subtle movement. A massive shape emerged from behind a cluster of trees about 30 feet from our cabin. My first thought was bear, but as the figure straightened up to its full height, I realized with horrifying certainty that this was no bear. This thing was huge, easily 8 or 9 feet tall. Its body was covered in dark, matted fur that looked almost black in the moonlight. But it wasn't the size that made my blood run cold. It was how it moved. It walked on 2 legs with an eerily human-like gait, though its arms were much longer than they should be, hanging almost to its knees. I stood there, paralyzed, as it moved closer to the cabin. Its head was massive and somewhat cone-shaped, sitting directly on broad shoulders with barely any neck visible. The fur around its face was lighter in color, creating a stark contrast that made its features more visible. Then it turned its head toward the window, and our eyes met. Its eyes were unlike anything I'd ever seen. They reflected the moonlight like a cat's eyes, but they were huge, easily visible even from that distance. They glowed with an amber-yellow color that seemed to pierce right through me. But what terrified me most was the intelligence I saw in those eyes. This wasn't some animal acting on instinct. There was purpose in its gaze. The creature took another step toward the cabin, and I could see its massive hands clearly now. They looked almost human-like, but were proportionally too large, with long fingers ending in dark, curved nails. These weren't claws like a bear's. They were more like extremely thick, powerful human fingernails. What happened next is something I'll never forget. The creature moved right up to the window, so close that its face was only inches from the glass on the other side. It was so tall that it had to bend down to look in. Then it exhaled heavily through what I assume was its nose, and its breath completely fogged up the window. The fog on the glass formed 2 distinct circles, suggesting nostrils much larger than a human's. As the fog began to fade, I could see its face more clearly than ever. Its features were a horrifying mix of human and ape-like characteristics. The eyes were set deep under a prominent brow ridge, and its nose was wide and flat. Its mouth was slightly open, revealing teeth that looked yellowish in the moonlight. I wanted to scream, to run, to do something, but I couldn't move. I couldn't even breathe. The creature and I just stared at each other for what felt like an eternity, but was probably only a few seconds. Then it did something that still haunts me to this day. It slowly raised one of its massive hands and pressed it against the glass. The window pane creaked under the pressure, and I could see each individual finger splayed out across the glass. Its palm alone was bigger than my entire head. The fingers were so long that they extended past the window frame. That's when I finally managed to move. I stumbled backward, tripping over my own feet and falling hard onto the wooden floor. The noise woke Sarah, who sat up confused and started to ask what was wrong. But before she could finish her question, we heard it. A sound that started as a low rumble and built into something between a roar and a scream. Unlike anything I'd ever heard before or since, the whole cabin seemed to vibrate with the sound. Sarah screamed, and suddenly the cabin was chaos. The other girls woke up, everyone was yelling, and I could hear running footsteps outside as the troop leaders rushed toward our cabin. By the time Miss Thompson burst through the door with her flashlight, the creature was gone. All that remained was the slowly fading fog on the window and that terrible, musty smell. The rest of the night was a blur of crying girls, concerned adults, and phone calls to parents. The official explanation was that we'd been scared by a bear, even though no tracks were found the next morning. The only evidence something had been there was a series of deep scratches in the wooden walls of the cabin, some of them nearly 7 feet off the ground. They moved us to different cabins closer to the main lodge for the remainder of the camp, but I barely slept. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw those glowing amber eyes staring back at me. That intelligent, almost curious look in them suggested something far more unsettling than any wild animal. I'm 26 now, and I've never gone camping again. I've researched similar encounters in the area and found a few reports that sound eerily similar to what I experienced, but I've never shared my story publicly until now. Sometimes I try to convince myself it was just my imagination, or that maybe it really was just a bear, but then I remember those eyes, that hand on the window, and that terrible sound it made. The thing that still bothers me most isn't the creature itself, though that was terrifying enough. It's the fact that it seemed to be studying us, learning about us. Those scratches weren't random. It was testing the strength of our cabin walls. And when it looked at me through that window, I didn't see the mindless aggression of a predator. I saw calculation, intelligence, purpose. I don't know what I encountered that night in Reading, but I do know one thing for certain. I'll never again investigate strange sounds in the dark. Some questions are better left unanswered. Story 12. I've never shared this story publicly before, but what happened to me and my buddy Tom back in 1970 has haunted me for over 50 years now. I was 32 at the time, working at the lumber mill in Tunica, Mississippi, and spent most of my weekends fishing on Tunica Lake and Flower Lake. Tom and I had this sweet fishing spot we'd found, a secluded inlet protected by a sandbar where we kept our small John boat tied up. Nobody else really knew about it, which made what happened that much stranger. It was early October, one of those perfect fall mornings where the air is crisp but not cold. The sun hadn't fully risen yet when we pulled up in my old Chevy pickup. Something felt off right away. You know that feeling in your gut when something just ain't right? That's exactly what hit me as we walked down the path to our spot. Our boat was completely flipped over, which made no sense because we always secured it properly. All our gear, tackle boxes, life vests, even the aluminum cooler we kept locked under the seat, was scattered in a line leading into the tree line. Some stuff was even 15-20 feet up into the woods. This wasn't vandalism or theft. Nothing was stolen or broken, just thrown around like a kid having a tantrum. Tom and I started gathering our things, not saying much because, honestly, what was there to say? The whole scene was just wrong. We'd been keeping our boat there for 3 years and never had any trouble. No kids came out this far, and any locals who fished knew better than to mess with someone else's gear. The air was dead still, and a heavy fog was hanging over the water. That's when we heard it, this awful cracking sound, like someone taking a baseball bat to a dead tree. But it wasn't just one crack. It was followed by several more getting closer. Tom froze mid-bend while picking up a tackle box, and I remember my hand tightening around the boat rope until my knuckles went white. About 30 yards away, through the morning mist and trees, something was moving. At first I thought it might be a bear, because whatever it was seemed to be hunched over. But as it got closer, moving in this weird, fluid way, I realized this was no bear. This thing was massive. I'd guess around 8 feet tall even while stooped over. Its shoulders were impossibly broad, and it was covered in dark, matted fur that looked almost black in the dim light. What happened next is something I've replayed in my mind thousands of times, trying to make sense of it. The creature suddenly stopped and did something I can only describe as unnatural. It twisted its head in a way no animal should be able to, almost like an owl, but more violent. The face, God, that face, had these deep-set eyes that caught what little light there was, reflecting back like 2 dark copper pennies. Its lips, and I know how crazy this sounds, curled back in a way that reminded me of a dog snarling, but the sound that came out, it wasn't a growl or a roar. It was this horrible hissing sound, similar to what you'd hear from an alligator, but deeper, and with this undertone that made my whole body go cold. I've been around wildlife my whole life, grew up hunting in these woods, encountered plenty of bears, cougars, and gators. But this was different. This thing moved wrong, sounded wrong. Everything about it was just wrong. Tom and I didn't run, couldn't run. We were frozen in place, watching this thing watching us. It took 1 step forward, and I swear the ground shook. That's what finally broke our trance. We backed away slowly toward my truck, never turning our backs to it. The creature stayed where it was, still making that ungodly hissing sound, head still twisted at that impossible angle. When we finally reached the truck, we got in as quietly as we could and drove away at a normal speed, afraid that gunning it might provoke whatever that thing was to chase us. We didn't speak for the first 10 minutes of the drive. What was there to say? We'd just seen something that shouldn't exist. But here's the thing. We went back the next day. Crazy, right? But we had to know. This time we brought our hunting rifles, my Remington 700 and Tom's Winchester. The boat was back in its normal position, but everything around it told a story we couldn't explain. There were these massive footprints in the mud, easily 16 inches long and 8 inches wide. They were deep too, like whatever made them was incredibly heavy. The really unsettling part was the trees. About 8 to 10 feet up, we found these bizarre marks. Not claw marks like a bear would make, but these weird, twisted patches where the bark had been completely stripped away. Some of the smaller trees were bent and broken in ways that would take incredible strength. We spent about an hour documenting everything we could see, taking measurements and even trying to make plaster casts of the footprints, but the mud was too wet and they kept collapsing. The whole time we were there, it felt like we were being watched. You know that feeling when the hair on the back of your neck stands up? It was like that, but constant. The strangest part, after that day, nothing. We kept fishing that spot for another 5 years until I moved away for work, and we never saw anything like that again. No more overturned boats, no mysterious footprints, no horrible hissing sounds. It was like whatever it was just disappeared as suddenly as it had appeared. I'm 84 now, and I've never told this story to anyone outside my immediate family. Most people would think I'm just a crazy old man, and maybe I am. But Tom saw it too, and before he passed away last year, we talked about it one last time. He remembered every detail exactly as I did. Whatever we saw that morning in 1970 was real, and it wasn't any animal known to science. I still fish, though not as much as I used to, but I never go out on the water without remembering that morning. Sometimes, especially on foggy days when the air is still, I catch myself scanning the tree line, half expecting to see that twisted head and those copper penny eyes staring back at me. Whatever that thing was, it changed how I see the world. There are things out there in the woods and swamps of Mississippi that defy explanation, things that shouldn't exist but do. The funny thing is, I don't feel scared telling this story anymore. Time has a way of dulling even the sharpest fears. But I do feel a responsibility to share it, not to convince anyone. I gave up on that a long time ago. But because it's true, every word of it, And maybe, just maybe, someone else out there has seen it too and needs to know they're not crazy. That's my story. Take it for what you will. But if you're ever fishing around Tunica Lake or Flower Lake, especially in those quiet hours just before dawn, keep your eyes on the tree line. And if you hear what sounds like a tree being torn apart, don't stick around to see what's making that sound. Some mysteries are better left alone. Story 13. That December, we had this idea to build a rope bridge in the wooded area behind our complex. Looking back, it probably wasn't the smartest thing to do without asking permission, but we were careful about it. We used these old tennis nets we found at the complex's courts after they replaced them with new ones. Dad was pretty handy and knew how to tie proper knots, so we made sure it was secure. It took us about 2 weekends to get it right, strung between 2 sturdy oak trees about 15 feet up. We even added some extra netting on the sides so we wouldn't fall out. The night it happened was December 12th. I remember the date clearly because it was supposed to be the peak of the Geminids' meteor shower. It was a clear, cold night, probably in the low 40s. We'd brought out some blankets and thermoses of hot chocolate, planning to watch for shooting stars from our makeshift observatory. The bridge was actually pretty comfortable once you got used to the slight swaying. We'd been up there for maybe an hour, just talking about school and life while watching the sky. It must have been around 10:30 p.m. when we first heard it. You know how when you're outside at night, every little sound seems amplified? Well, this wasn't like that. These were distinct footsteps crunching through the dead leaves on the ground, slow and deliberate. At first, I thought it was someone from the complex taking a late-night walk, even though nobody really came out to this area, especially not at night. My dad and I both went quiet, not wanting to draw attention to ourselves since we weren't supposed to be there with our unauthorized bridge and all. The footsteps got closer, and that's when I started getting this weird feeling in my stomach. They didn't sound right. The timing between steps was off somehow, like whoever or whatever was walking had an unusual gait. My dad must have felt it too because he grabbed my arm and squeezed it gently, our signal to stay absolutely still. We were positioned, so the moonlight was behind us, which meant we could see pretty well into the darker areas below. That's when I saw it, and I swear my heart nearly stopped. A leg, just one leg, stepped into a patch of moonlight between the trees. The sight is burned into my memory. It was bare, no fur or clothing, and had this sickly bluish-grey color that looked completely unnatural. The foot was huge, probably 10 inches at least, with toes that seemed longer than they should be. The weird thing is, I couldn't see the rest of whatever it belonged to. It's like the leg just disappeared into the shadows above it. My dad and I were both frozen, barely breathing. The leg stood there for what felt like forever, but was probably only a few seconds before it moved again, stepping back into the darkness. We heard shuffling sounds, and then we saw movement under this big magnolia tree about 20 feet away. The branches were swaying slightly, even though there wasn't any wind. Whatever it was hiding there, and I got the distinct feeling it was watching us. My dad always carried this old Crosman pellet pistol when we went into the woods, supposedly for snakes, though we'd never needed it. With shaking hands, he pulled it out of his jacket pocket. I remember thinking how useless a BB gun would be if this thing decided to come after us, but I was glad he had something, anything. When he fired the first shot toward the magnolia tree, what happened next still haunts me. The creature let out this sound. I've tried for years to find the right way to describe it. You know when you're walking past a playground and you hear kids screaming while playing? It was like that, but wrong. Like someone trying to imitate a child's scream but not quite getting it right. The sound started high-pitched and then dropped to this guttural tone that made my whole body tense up. The thing burst out from under the tree and all hell broke loose. Branches were snapping, leaves were rustling, and that awful screaming continued as it crashed through the underbrush. It was moving so fast that all I could see was a pale blur in the darkness. The sound of its retreat echoed through the woods for what seemed like minutes, but was probably only seconds before everything went completely silent again. We stayed up in that bridge for another 2 hours, too terrified to move. My dad kept the pellet gun trained on the spot where we'd last seen it, his hands trembling the whole time. We didn't speak, we barely breathed. Finally, when we couldn't take the cold anymore and had convinced ourselves it wasn't coming back, we climbed down and ran all the way back to our apartment. The next morning, we went back to check the area in daylight. We found broken branches under the magnolia tree and some weird scrape marks on the trunk. But that was it. No footprints. The ground was too covered with dead leaves and pine needles. We took down the rope bridge that day and never built another one. I've tried researching what we might have seen that night. The closest thing I can find are some obscure cryptid sightings in the Carolinas, but none of them quite match what we encountered. The blue-gray skin, the childlike scream, the way it moved. It doesn't fit neatly into any category I've found. My dad and I still talk about it sometimes, trying to make sense of what happened. We've never told anyone else in the family. Who would believe us? We even drove back to that spot a few years later when we were visiting Charlotte. We moved to Pennsylvania in 2008, but the whole area has been developed now. There's a shopping center where our woods used to be. I still can't explain what we saw that night. Sometimes I almost convince myself it was just some weird trick of the moonlight, or maybe someone playing an elaborate prank. But then I remember that scream, that unnatural leg, and the absolute terror we felt, and I know whatever it wasn't human. The strangest part is that after that night, we never saw or heard anything like it again. It's like it just appeared for that one moment in time and then vanished forever, leaving us with nothing but questions and a story we can barely believe ourselves. I don't go stargazing much anymore, and when I do, it's never from anywhere higher than a lawn chair. Some experiences change you like that, you know. They make you realize that maybe there are things out there we're not supposed to understand, things that don't fit into our neat categories of what's real and what isn't. Whatever we saw that night in Charlotte was real, I'm sure of that much. But what it was, where it came from, and where it went, I guess I'll never know. Last week, my son, he's 12, asked me if we could build a tree house in our backyard. I came up with some excuse about property values and HOA rules, but the real reason is that I can't shake the memory of that night. Every time I think about being up in the trees again, I remember that pale blue leg stepping into the moonlight, and my answer is always going to be no. Story 14. Mike and I had been planning this camping trip for weeks. We're both experienced outdoorsmen, grew up hunting and camping in Alberta, know the wilderness like the back of our hands. The spot we chose was pretty remote, about 15 miles west of Turner Valley. Nothing fancy, just a small clearing we'd used before during hunting season. We arrived Friday afternoon around 3 p.m. The weather was typical for October in Alberta, crisp and cool, maybe around 45 Idaho, 70°C. The fall colors were stunning, but something felt off. You know that feeling when you walk into a room and everyone suddenly stops talking? That's what the forest felt like. No birds chirping, no squirrels rustling in the leaves. Nothing. Mike noticed it too, but we brushed it off, thinking maybe a predator had passed through recently. We set up camp efficiently. We'd done this hundreds of times before. 2-person tent, small fire pit, basic stuff. Around dusk, while we were gathering firewood, I saw something that made me freeze. About 100 yards away between the trees, 2 large shapes were moving. At first, I thought they were bears playing, but the way they moved was just wrong. Too fluid, too deliberate. They were walking upright, and they were massive, easily 8 feet tall. "Mike," I whispered, "look over there." He saw them too. We both stood absolutely still, watching these things interact. They seemed to be playing or maybe foraging, moving branches aside with purposeful movements. The light was fading fast, but I could swear I saw arms that were way too long, hanging almost to their knees. That's when we heard it. A deep, guttural growl that made every hair on my body stand up. It wasn't like anything I'd ever heard before, and I've encountered pretty much every predator in these woods. This sound, it was almost like a lion's roar mixed with something else, something almost human. It came from behind us, maybe 50 yards away. We slowly turned around, and I'll never forget what I saw. Through the trees, there was this massive silhouette. The failing light made it hard to make out details, but its eyes caught what was left of the daylight and reflected it back at us. The creature was covered in silvery grey fur that seemed to shimmer slightly in the dusk. Suddenly, we heard gunshots in the distance, probably some hunters making their way back to their camp. The creature's head snapped toward the sound, and then all hell broke loose. We could hear heavy footsteps, and I mean heavy, crashing through the underbrush. Branches were breaking everywhere around us, and it sounded like we were surrounded. The silvery grey one we'd seen emerged into a clearer area about 40 yards from us. It was enormous, probably 9 feet tall, with a massive barrel chest and those impossibly long arms. Its face, its face was almost human-like but distorted, with a pronounced brow ridge and wide, flat nose. It picked up a massive branch, must have been at least 5 inches thick, and threw it in our direction with incredible force. It didn't hit us, but I'm sure that was intentional. A warning shot. That's when we noticed the second one. Slightly smaller, maybe 7 feet tall, but moving with the same incredible power. This one had darker fur and seemed more cautious, staying partly hidden behind the trees. They were working together, moving in a way that was clearly meant to intimidate us and drive us out of their territory. We didn't need any more convincing. We started backing away slowly toward our campsite, never turning our backs to them. The larger one would occasionally break branches or throw small rocks near us, not trying to hit us, but definitely sending a message. The smaller one kept making this weird, low humming sound that seemed to reverberate in my chest. It took us what felt like hours to reach our tent, though it was probably only 15-20 minutes. The creatures followed us the entire way, staying just visible enough to let us know they were there. When we reached the campsite, the larger one let out a roar that I swear shook the ground. We grabbed our essential gear, left the tent and everything else behind, and got the hell out of there. The walk back to our truck was the most terrifying experience of my life. We could hear them paralleling us through the woods, breaking branches and making those horrible sounds. They escorted us all the way to the edge of the forest, never letting us see them clearly in the darkness, but making damn sure we knew they were there. We made it to the truck around 10 p.m. and drove straight home. When we went back the next day with a ranger, we had to report the abandoned gear. Our campsite was completely destroyed. The tent was shredded, our cooler was smashed to pieces, and we found massive human-like footprints all around the area. The ranger took pictures and measurements, but nothing ever came of it officially. Here's the thing that still haunts me. These creatures were intelligent. The way they coordinated, the way they deliberately intimidated us without actually hurting us, the way they escorted us out of their territory, it was all purposeful. They weren't just animals acting on instinct. They knew exactly what they were doing. I still go camping and hunting, but never in that part of Turner Valley. Sometimes when I'm in the woods and everything goes quiet, I get that same feeling from that day, and I know it's time to leave. Mike and I don't talk about it much, but when we do, we both agree on one thing. Whatever we encountered that day, It wasn't supposed to exist. It wasn't supposed to be real. But it was, and it changed everything we thought we knew about what's really out there in the wilderness. I've never been able to explain what happened that day in any rational way. The creatures appeared suddenly, made their presence known in no uncertain terms, and then, just as suddenly, they were gone, leaving us with nothing but destroyed gear and a story that most people would never believe. But I know what I saw. I know what I heard. And I know that somewhere out there in the forests of Turner Valley, there are things that defy explanation, things that don't want to be found, but will make damn sure you know when you've wandered into their territory. Story 15. I was just a 19-year-old kid back then, doing my military service at Fort Lewis in Washington State. What I experienced that night in 1970 while guarding the McCord Air Force Base munitions depot still gives me chills. I've never told this story publicly before, but I need to get it off my chest. I was working the graveyard shift from midnight to 800. It was early October, and the weather was getting colder. You know how Washington gets in the fall. The depot was surrounded by dense forest, and we took security seriously because there had been threats from local militia groups trying to get their hands on military equipment. That night was especially dark, one of those nights where the clouds block out even the faintest starlight. We had floodlights around the perimeter fence, but they created these weird shadows in the tree line that played tricks on your eyes. The wind was strong enough to make the pine trees sway, which didn't help with the shadows. I was doing my regular patrol route, M16 slung over my shoulder, checking the perimeter fence. We had layers of security, chain link topped with razor wire, motion sensors, the works. The depot itself was about half a mile from the main road, connected by a narrow access road flanked by forest on both sides. Around 0200, I heard something that made my blood run cold. It wasn't like the usual forest sounds, the owls, wind in the trees, or small animals. This was different. It was like heavy footsteps, but not quite. More like something massive moving through the underbrush. The sound seemed to be coming from the tree line about 50 yards to my left. My first thought was militia activity. We'd been briefed extensively about potential threats, and I immediately radioed in, Post 7 to base, possible movement in the tree line, Sector 4. The response was quick. Copy Post 7, backup is en route, maintain visual, and report any changes. That's when it happened. I was scanning the tree line with my flashlight when I saw movement. Not in the trees, but on the access road about 30 yards ahead of me. What stepped out onto that road? I still have trouble processing it. The floodlights caught it perfectly. This figure was massive. Not just tall, but huge. My first instinct was to think it was someone on stilts, but the movement was too fluid, too natural. It crossed that 20-foot wide road in 3 steps. 3 fucking steps. I'm not ashamed to admit I froze. My training, all those drills, everything just went blank. This thing stopped about 2 feet from me, and I could smell it. A strong, musky odor that burned my nostrils. It was covered in dark, matted hair and had to be at least 8 or 9 feet tall. The eyes, they weren't animal eyes, but they weren't human either. They had an intelligence to them that terrified me more than anything else. For what felt like an eternity but was probably only seconds, we just stood there. Me, a terrified kid with an M16 I couldn't even think to raise, and this creature just looking at me. I could hear its breathing, deep, heavy breaths that seemed too controlled to be animal. Then the backup arrived. The sound of the approaching vehicle seemed to break whatever spell I was under. The creature turned its head toward the sound, and in one fluid motion, it moved back toward the tree line. I say moved because I can't really describe how it covered that distance. It wasn't exactly running, but it covered about 40 yards in what seemed like just a few seconds. The backup team arrived with M60s mounted on their jeeps, lighting up the area with spotlights. By then, The creature was gone. But what happened next makes this whole thing even more real to me. The Criminal Investigation Division, CID, showed up within the hour. They treated it like a serious security breach, not some kid's wild imagination. They found footprints, massive ones, 17 or 18 inches long. The detail in them was incredible. You could see toe impressions, the arch, everything. They took plaster casts. But what really got them excited was the hair. On the top row of razor wire, about 8 feet up, they found tufts of dark hair snagged in the barbs. They collected it all as evidence. For the next week, we had increased patrols, additional spotlights, and thermal imaging equipment installed. The official report listed it as a potential security breach by unknown individuals, but I saw how the CID agents looked at those footprints. They knew this wasn't some guy in a costume. The weirdest part? Despite all the extra security, despite the motion sensors and thermal imaging, we never saw it again. It just vanished into the forest like it had never existed. The hair samples and footprint casts were sent off for analysis, but I never heard the results. When I asked about it a few months later, my commanding officer just said the case was classified and told me to forget about it. I'm 72 now, and I've had a long time to think about what I saw that night. I've read about other sightings, talked to other veterans who served at various bases in the Pacific Northwest, and I know I'm not alone in what I experienced. But my encounter was different. This wasn't some distant figure in the woods or a shadow moving through trees. I was face to face with something that shouldn't exist, something that made me question everything I thought I knew about the world. The military's response is what really gets me. They didn't dismiss it or laugh it off. They treated it like a serious security threat. Those CID agents, they knew something. The way they documented everything, the questions they asked. They dealt with this before. I still dream about those eyes sometimes. That intelligence. It wasn't just some animal looking back at me. Whatever I encountered that night, it knew exactly what it was doing. It knew it was on a military installation, knew it was somewhere it shouldn't be. And sometimes, in my darker moments, I wonder if it was studying us just as much as we were trying to study it. The forest around Fort Lewis holds secrets. I know that now. And sometimes, late at night when I can't sleep, I think about that creature out there in the Pacific Northwest wilderness. Is it still out there? Are there more of them? And why did it come so close to a military installation that night? I don't expect anyone to believe me. Hell, if someone had told me this story before it happened, I wouldn't have believed them either. But I know what I saw. I know what I smelled. And I know that somewhere in a classified military file, there's evidence of something that science says shouldn't exist. To this day, I can't go camping. The sound of wind through pine trees makes my heart race. And every time I hear about another sighting in the Pacific Northwest, I think back to that night in 1970, when a 19-year-old kid came face to face with something that changed his understanding of the world forever. Story 16. It was the first day of daylight saving time, and I remember being extra groggy because of the lost hour of sleep. The sky was just starting to lighten up, that weird pre-dawn grey where everything looks kind of fuzzy and unclear. I was driving down Road 33, making my usual deliveries, when something caught my attention up ahead. At first, I thought it was just fog rolling across the road, but as I got closer, I realized it was a huge herd of deer, probably 15 or 20 of them, absolutely booking it across the pavement. Now, I'd seen plenty of deer in my time doing this route, but never anything like this. These animals were terrified. They were stumbling over each other, making these distressed sounds I'd never heard deer make before. Something had spooked them bad. I slowed down, partly to avoid hitting any stragglers, but also because the hair on the back of my neck was standing up. That's when I noticed the movement in the tree line they'd come from. Something big was moving through those trees. The branches were swaying and cracking, but in the dim light I couldn't make out what it was. Whatever it was massive, way too big to be a black bear, and it was moving fast. I remember sitting there in my car, engine idling, just staring into those woods. The smart thing would have been to drive away immediately, but curiosity got the better of me. I cut my headlights and waited. For maybe 30 seconds, there was absolute silence. Even the usual morning birds had gone quiet. Then I heard it, this deep, rumbling breath, like something huge drawing in air. It wasn't quite a growl, but it wasn't like anything I'd ever heard before either. That was enough for me. I got out of there quick and finished my route as fast as I could, but I couldn't stop thinking about it. I told myself it was probably just some weird combination of shadows and my tired mind playing tricks on me. But deep down, I knew better. A few days later, I was on Road 411. It's this dirt road that leads down to the sailing club. It was around the same time of morning, maybe 5:30 a.m. The area there is heavily wooded, with all these limestone cliffs and cave systems running through it. I always thought it was beautiful in a wild sort of way, but that morning it felt different. Oppressive somehow. I had my window down because it was unusually warm for March, and that's when I heard it. A scream. But not like a human scream. This was something else entirely. It started low and built into this horrible roaring shriek that echoed off the cliffs. It was close too. Couldn't have been more than 100 yards into the woods. My whole body just locked up. The sound lasted maybe 5 seconds, but it felt like forever. Then it turned into this deep, threatening growl that seemed to vibrate the air around me. I hit the gas and got out of there, but my hands were shaking so bad I could barely hold the steering wheel. The rest of that morning's deliveries were a blur. I kept telling myself I needed to find another job, but the truth is, I was becoming obsessed with whatever was out there. Over the next few weeks, I started noticing little things, places where the underbrush was crushed down in unnatural ways, broken branches way too high up to be from deer or bears, and the smell. Sometimes I'd catch this weird, musky odor that reminded me of wet dog mixed with something rotting. But the worst was yet to come. It was about a week after the scream incident. Same route, same time of morning. I was on a particularly dark stretch of Road 33, where the trees form this kind of tunnel over the road. I remember checking my rearview mirror and seeing these eyes reflecting in my taillights. They were way too high off the ground, probably 6 feet up at least, and they weren't yellow like a deer's or green like a cat's. They were this deep, reddish amber color, and they were huge. I floored it. Whatever it was, it actually kept pace with my car for a few seconds before disappearing into the woods. When I got home that morning, I noticed these weird scratches on the back of my car. 3 parallel marks that no animal I know of could have made. The thing that really gets me is how perfect that area was for something to hide in. The Tennessee River creates this whole network of secluded valleys and coves. There are dozens of unmapped caves in those limestone cliffs. The whole place is this maze of waterways and dense forest. You could hide an army in there and nobody would know. I kept delivering papers for another month after that last incident, but I never saw those eyes again. Never heard another scream. It was like whatever it was just disappeared back into the wilderness it came from. But sometimes, especially on foggy mornings, I'd get this feeling of being watched. Like something was just waiting in those trees, following my car with its eyes. I ended up quitting that job in April. Told my boss it was because I found something better paying, but really, I couldn't take the stress anymore. Every morning was like playing Russian roulette, never knowing if this would be the day I'd have another encounter. Looking back now, I still can't explain what I experienced. I've read about black bears, cougars, and every other predator that's supposed to live in North Alabama. None of them match what I saw and heard. The locals sometimes talk about Bigfoot sightings in the area, and I used to laugh those off. I don't laugh anymore. I've never told this story publicly before because honestly, who would believe it? But I know what I saw. I know what I heard. And I know that something was out there in those woods. Something that shouldn't exist but does. Sometimes I drive past that area during the day now, and it looks so normal, so peaceful. But I won't go near it at dawn anymore. Some things are better left alone. The weird thing is, I've checked local news archives from that time, thinking surely someone else must have reported something similar. But there's nothing. Just like whatever it was appeared in my life suddenly and disappeared just as mysteriously, there's no trace of it ever having been there. Except for those scratches on my old car. I took photos of those before I sold it, just to prove to myself I wasn't crazy. I look at them sometimes late at night and wonder what really was out there in the darkness of Lauderdale County. Story 17. I've been hunting for over 25 years now, but what happened to me in Wayne County back in '95 still keeps me up at night sometimes. I'm not the type to believe in crazy stuff. I'm just a regular guy who loves hunting and knows these woods like the back of my hand. But what I experienced that September, well, I still can't explain it. I'd gotten permission to hunt on this piece of land that supplied the paper mill. It was pretty remote, probably hadn't seen many hunters before. The owner just asked me to be careful with any equipment I might come across. Fair enough. I'd scouted the area a couple times before and it seemed perfect. Lots of deer signs, good terrain, quiet. That morning in September I headed out super early, around 4 a.m. I always like getting to my spot well before sunrise, get settled in, you know how it is. I was driving my old '78 Blazer down this narrow access road and something felt off. Now, any hunter knows that feeling when you're in the woods and things aren't quite right. Usually, it's the silence that tips you off, when the crickets stop chirping or the birds go quiet. But this was different. This was like someone had hit the mute button on the whole forest. No owls, no crickets, nothing. Just this heavy silence that seemed to press down on you. I've been in quiet woods before, but this was something else entirely. It made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. I was about halfway to my planned hunting spot when I heard this thud against my Blazer. Something had hit the passenger side. I stopped and got out with my flashlight to check, found a decent-sized rock laying there. Now, rocks don't just throw themselves. I swept my light around but couldn't see anything through the thick undergrowth. The silence was even worse outside the truck. You know that feeling when you're being watched? It was like that, but cranked up to 11. I'm not ashamed to admit it. I got back in my truck and got out of there. Called my dad on the way home. He's been hunting these woods since before I was born, and told him what happened. He could tell I was rattled, which isn't like me at all. He offered to come check it out with me that afternoon. We went back around 2 p.m. Everything looked different in the daylight. Less menacing, you know. But about a quarter-mile down that same access road, we found something that made my stomach drop. A tree had been knocked down across the path, not cut, not blown over by wind, but literally pushed over from the base. This was a healthy oak, maybe 14 inches in diameter. My dad and I just stood there staring at it. The root system was partially torn out of the ground, like something had just shoved it over. I couldn't stop thinking about it all week. Part of me wanted to just find a new hunting spot, but I've never been one to back down easily. So the next weekend, I decided to go back. This time I waited until afternoon. Figured whatever it was might be less active during daylight hours. I parked my Blazer about a half-mile from where we'd found that tree. The plan was to walk in quietly, do some scouting, maybe set up a stand if things felt right. I'd been walking for maybe 15 minutes when I heard it. You know that sound a deer makes when it's crashing through thick brush? Multiply that by 10. Something massive was moving through the forest, breaking branches like they were twigs. The sound started maybe 50 yards to my right, and whatever it was moving fast. The brush was so thick I couldn't see it, but I could track its movement by the way the trees were shaking. Then it stopped, right at the edge of this particularly dense thicket. I could hear branches snapping, leaves rustling, but in a deliberate way, like something was standing there, moving around, but staying just out of sight. That's when the smell hit me. Everyone who's spent time in the woods knows different animal smells, the musty scent of deer, the rank odor of a wild hog. This was nothing like that. The best way I can describe it is like a wet basement mixed with rotting meat, but there was something else to it, something, I don't know, almost human-like about it. I stood there frozen, my heart pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. The thing in the thicket started making these sounds. Not quite grunts, not quite breathing, but something in between. Deep, rhythmic sounds that seemed to come from something with massive lungs. The branches would shake every few seconds, like whatever it was shifting its weight from foot to foot. I had my rifle, but my hands were shaking so bad I doubt I could have hit anything if I tried. The logical part of my brain was trying to catalogue what this could be. Bear? No. We didn't have bears in that area. Hogs? Too big, too deliberate in its movements. Every explanation I came up with fell apart as soon as I thought of it. This standoff lasted maybe 5 minutes, but it felt like hours. I didn't dare move. Then, without warning, there was this deep, rumbling sound, almost like a growl, but so low it made my chest vibrate. The trees started shaking more violently, and whatever it was began moving again, this time parallel to where I stood. The sound of its movement gradually faded into the distance, but I swear I could feel its presence lingering in the area. I waited until I was absolutely sure it was gone before I moved. My legs were shaking so bad I could barely walk, but I got out of there as fast as I could while still trying to stay quiet. I kept looking over my shoulder, expecting to see something emerge from the trees, but nothing did. When I finally made it back to my truck, I sat there for a long time, trying to process what had just happened. The rational part of my mind was working overtime, trying to explain it away. But I know what I experienced. The silence, the rock, the fallen tree, and finally that encounter. It all added up to something I still can't explain. I've never gone back to that spot. Got my hunting permission transferred to a different area the next season. Sometimes I think about going back, maybe setting up some trail cameras to try to document whatever's out there. But then I remember that sound, that smell, that feeling of being in the presence of something that shouldn't exist, and I decide against it. I've told this story to a few other hunters over the years. Some think I'm crazy, others have similar stories of their own. All I know is that there's something out there in those woods that defies explanation. I don't need to know what it was. I'm just glad I made it out of there to tell about it. The strange thing is, after that day, everything just stopped. No more incidents, no more strange occurrences. It's like whatever it was just disappeared as mysteriously as it had appeared. The paper mill land got sold a few years later, and I heard they cleared a lot of it for development. Part of me wonders if they found anything during the clearing, but I never asked. Some questions are better left unanswered. Story 18. I was stationed at Naval Base Kitsap back in '98, and I'd gotten pretty into hiking during my off time. The Pacific Northwest was totally different from my hometown in Florida, and I wanted to make the most of it. I'd done plenty of day hikes, but I'd been itching to do an overnight trip, something more challenging. That's how I ended up planning a solo hike to bear camp. Looking back, going alone was stupid, but I was 22 in the Navy and thought I was invincible. I'd done my research, packed all the essentials, and even borrowed some gear from a buddy who was big into camping. I had my topographic maps, compass, first aid kit, enough food and water, and a small 4-inch camping knife, which later felt about as useful as a toothpick. I started early that morning, around 6 a.m. The trail was tough but manageable, winding through some of the most impressive forest I'd ever seen. Those Douglas firs were like nature's skyscrapers, making me feel tiny in comparison. The weather was perfect for hiking, cloudy but dry, typical PNW weather, probably in the mid-60s. After about 8 hours of hiking, stopping only for quick breaks and lunch, I finally reached bear camp. I was exhausted but proud of myself for making the 16-mile trek. The campsite was this small clearing between two massive Douglas firs with enough flat ground for my one-person tent. I remember checking my watch. It was just past 2 p.m. I set up camp methodically, just like I'd practiced in my backyard, got the tent up, arranged my sleeping bag, and organized my gear. I even managed to get a small fire going and heat up some freeze-dried stroganoff for dinner. Everything was textbook perfect. The sun set around 8 p.m., and I decided to turn in early. The hike had worn me out, and I was looking forward to a good night's sleep. I remember lying in my sleeping bag, feeling pretty pleased with myself for pulling off my first solo overnight hike. That's when everything changed. I was jolted awake sometime between 1 and 2 a.m. by what sounded like footsteps, heavy ones. At first, in my groggy state, I thought it might be a bear. We'd had bear safety drills during my outdoor prep, so I stayed still and quiet, hoping it would just pass by. But these footsteps were different. They were deliberate, methodical. Each step was distinct, with a pause between them. Not the shuffling you'd expect from a bear. And they were heavy, much heavier than any black bear. The ground literally trembled with each step. My heart was pounding so hard I was afraid whatever it was might hear it. I lay there in my sleeping bag, barely breathing, as the footsteps circled my campsite. That's when I noticed the pattern. It was making a deliberate circuit around my camp, staying just at the edge of where the tree branches ended. The third time around, it stopped. That's when I heard it, this deep, guttural sound that I still can't properly describe. It wasn't a growl, wasn't a roar. It was almost like someone trying to talk while gargling, but deeper, more resonant. The sound seemed to come from way above ground level, maybe 8 or 9 feet up. Then, and this is what still gives me nightmares, something answered from the meadow about half a mile away. The same kind of sound, but fainter, like they were communicating. I was clutching my pathetic 4-inch knife, knowing full well it would be useless if whatever was out there decided to attack. The tent suddenly felt like it was made of tissue paper rather than nylon. I could see the shadow of something massive through the tent wall when the moon briefly came out from behind the clouds. This went on for what felt like hours, the walking, the stopping, those awful sounds. Sometimes it would get so close to the tent that I could hear what sounded like breathing, deep, heavy breaths that no human could make. The smell was distinctive too, like wet dog mixed with rotting vegetation, but much more pungent. I don't know exactly when it left. The footsteps gradually moved away, and the forest slowly returned to its normal nighttime sounds. But I didn't move a muscle until I saw the first hint of dawn through my tent wall. As soon as there was enough light to see, I started packing up. My hands were shaking so bad I could barely roll up my sleeping bag. That's when I saw them, the footprints. They were huge, easily 16 inches long, deeply pressed into the soft ground around my campsite. The stride length was massive, much longer than any human could make. And they formed a perfect circle around where my tent had been, right at the edge of the tree line, exactly where I'd heard the steps. I snapped a few photos with my disposable camera, but my hands were shaking so badly that when I got them developed later, they were all blurry and unusable. I've kicked myself 1,000 times for not taking more time to document everything better, but honestly, in that moment, all I could think about was getting the hell out of there. I made that 16-mile hike back in record time. I barely stopped to rest, constantly looking over my shoulder. Every snapping twig made me jump. I didn't feel safe until I was back in my car. I never went camping alone again after that. Hell, it took me years to go hiking at all, and even now, I won't go into the backcountry. Some of my Navy buddies used to give me grief about it, but they weren't there. They didn't hear those sounds, feel those footsteps, or see those prints. I've spent countless hours researching what it could have been. I've read about every large animal native to the Olympic Peninsula. Nothing matches what I experienced. The park rangers I reported it to just gave me the standard lecture about bears and mountain lions, but I know what bear and mountain lion tracks look like. This was something else entirely. The thing that still gets me all these years later is how deliberate it all felt. Whatever it wasn't just some animal randomly wandering through my campsite. It was studying me, communicating with others of its kind, and chose to let me be. I don't know why it didn't attack. Maybe it was just curious. Maybe I got lucky. Or maybe, I don't know. I'm married now, with kids of my own. Sometimes they beg me to take them camping, and I always make up excuses about why we should go to the beach instead. How do you explain to your children that their father is terrified of something he can't even explain? How do you tell them that there are things in this world that we don't understand? Things that shouldn't exist but do? I still have nightmares about that night. Sometimes I wake up in a cold sweat, thinking I can hear those heavy footsteps circling my house. My wife says I talk in my sleep during these episodes, making strange guttural sounds, as if trying to mimic what I heard that night. I know how this all sounds. If someone had told me this story before it happened to me, I probably wouldn't have believed them either. But I know what I experienced. That night in Olympic National Forest changed everything I thought I knew about what exists in our world. Some things are better left alone, and some places in our wilderness should remain unexplored. The rational part of my brain has spent years trying to explain it away. Stress, exhaustion, imagination. But deep down, I know what I encountered that night was real. Whatever it was intelligent, it was massive, and it was definitely not human. And sometimes, late at night when I can't sleep, I wonder if it remembers me too, and if somewhere in those vast forests of the Olympic Peninsula, it's still out there, watching and waiting for the next solitary camper to wander into its territory. Story 19. It was early October, and we'd planned this camping trip for weeks. Mike and I had been friends since high school and tried to get out to the wilderness at least once a year. We're both experienced outdoorsmen. I've been hunting since I was 12, and Mike worked as a park ranger for a few years. We know how to handle ourselves in the woods and can identify most wildlife in the Pacific Northwest. We'd picked a remote spot in the North Cascades, about 15 miles from the nearest town. The weather forecast looked perfect, cool but not cold, with clear skies. We packed our usual gear, tents, sleeping bags, food for 3 days, emergency supplies, and our rifles. I brought my old Remington 700, mainly for peace of mind since it was bear country. We hit the trail around 2 p.m., wanting to set up camp before dark. The hike in was beautiful. Typical Pacific Northwest scenery with towering Douglas firs and dense undergrowth. Everything seemed normal at first. We saw a few deer tracks, heard birds calling, all the usual forest sounds. Around 4 p.m., we found a good spot to make camp near a small stream. That's when things started feeling off. While we were setting up the tents, I noticed the forest had gotten unusually quiet. If you spend time outdoors, you know there's always background noise, birds, squirrels, insects. But everything just stopped. Mike noticed it too, and gave me this look I'll never forget. "You hearing this?" he asked. I nodded. The silence was deafening. We finished setting up camp, trying to shake off the weird feeling. I grabbed my binoculars to scout the area while Mike got the fire going. That's when I saw them. Two large, dark figures moving through the trees about 200 yards away. At first I thought they were bears, but something about the way they moved wasn't right. They were too tall, too upright. My hands were shaking as I handed the binoculars to Mike. "Check this out," I whispered. He looked for a few seconds, then slowly lowered them. "Those aren't bears," he said quietly. His face had gone pale. We kept watching until they disappeared into the thicker forest. I wanted to leave right then, but it was getting dark, and hiking out at night seemed more dangerous than staying put. We made sure the fire was good and strong, checked our rifles, and tried to act normal while we ate dinner. Neither of us wanted to say what we were thinking. Around 8 p.m. we heard it, branches breaking deeper in the forest, but not like when a deer moves through. These were big branches, and the sound was rhythmic, like footsteps. Then came this smell, like wet dog mixed with something rotten. I've been around plenty of wild animals, but I'd never smelled anything like this. We grabbed our flashlights and rifles. The sounds were getting closer. Through the trees we could see movement, something big. Then we heard this sound. I don't know how to describe it properly. It started as a deep growl but turned into something else, something that made my whole body go cold. It wasn't a bear, wasn't a cougar, wasn't anything I'd ever heard in my life. Suddenly, 2 gunshots rang out in the distance, probably other hunters, though we hadn't seen any signs of people all day. Whatever was near our camp didn't like that. We heard heavy footsteps moving fast, more branches breaking. Then, at the edge of our campfire's light, I saw it. It was massive, at least 8 feet tall, with silvery grey hair covering its body. The way it moved was so fluid, so human-like, but not human at all. When we pointed our flashlights at it, it turned away quickly, like it was deliberately hiding its face. The muscle definition under its hair was incredible. This wasn't some person in a suit. This was something else entirely. Then we saw the second one. Smaller, maybe 7 feet tall, but built the same way. It started breaking off branches from a nearby tree and throwing them in our direction. Not directly at us, but close enough to make its point. They were working together, moving around our camp, staying just at the edge of the light. We stayed up all night, backs to the fire, rifles ready. They never came closer, but they never really left either. We could hear them moving around, breaking branches, making these weird whooping sounds to each other. Sometimes they'd knock on trees, loud, deliberate knocks that would get answered from another direction. The sun finally came up around 6 a.m. and everything just stopped. The creatures were gone, the forest sounds came back, and if it wasn't for the broken branches scattered around our camp, I might have convinced myself it was all a bad dream. We packed up in record time and got the hell out of there. The hike back was tense. We kept feeling like we were being watched, but never saw anything. We made it back to the car around 9 a.m. and drove straight home. Mike and I have talked about that night 100 times since then. We've looked at every possible explanation, but nothing fits what we saw. Those weren't bears. They weren't people in suits. The way they moved, communicated, worked together, it was intelligent but wild at the same time. I've never gone back to that part of the woods, and I don't plan to. Mike still camps and hikes, but not there. Sometimes I'll be lying in bed at night, and I'll hear a branch break outside my window, and for a split second I'm right back there, watching those creatures move through the trees, smelling that awful smell, hearing those impossible sounds. I know how this story sounds. If someone told it to me, I probably wouldn't believe them. But I know what I saw. I know what I experienced. And I know there are things in those woods that we can't explain. I don't need anyone to believe me. I just needed to finally tell someone about what happened that night in Diablo. Story 20. I'd been working that post for about 3 months when things started getting weird. The job was pretty straightforward. Watch for smoke, radio in anything suspicious, maintain some basic records. The isolation never bothered me much. I actually enjoyed the peace and quiet. The Forest Service had set me up with this old trailer at a logging site. Nothing fancy, but it had the basics. A bed, small kitchen, bathroom. Everything I needed for my 6-month contract. Around mid-July, my buddy Mike came up to stay for what was supposed to be a weekend visit. He'd been going through a rough divorce and needed to clear his head. I figured some time in the wilderness would do him good. Man, if I'd known what was coming, I never would have invited him. The first night was normal enough. We grilled some burgers, had a few beers, caught up on life. The stars were incredible that night. You don't get that kind of view in the city. Everything changed around 2 a.m. We were both sleeping when this massive thud hit the side of the trailer. At first, I thought maybe a branch had fallen, but then another hit came, and another. These weren't random. Something was throwing rocks at us. I grabbed my flashlight and tried looking out the window, but it was pitch black out there. The rocks kept coming, not huge ones, but big enough to make dents in the trailer's metal siding. Mike was freaking out, asking what the hell was going on. I'd dealt with bears before, but this was different. Bears don't throw rocks. The attacks lasted about an hour that first night. We barely slept afterward, jumping at every little sound. When morning came, I found rocks scattered all around the trailer. Not natural placement, they'd definitely been thrown. But what really got to me were the footprints. They were huge, easily 16 inches long, pressed deep into the soft earth around the trailer. They looked human-like, but way too big. I'd heard stories from other rangers about Bigfoot, but I'd always laughed them off. I wasn't laughing anymore. Mike decided to stay longer, partly because he was worried about leaving me alone, partly because he was morbidly curious about what was happening. We spent that day boarding up most of the windows with plywood I had stored for emergencies. The Forest Service radio was our only link to civilization, but who could we tell? That some giant apes were attacking us with rocks. They'd think we were drunk or crazy. The second night was worse. The rock throwing started earlier, around sunset. But this time there was something else. We could hear movement around the trailer, heavy footsteps circling us. Then came the smell. God, that smell. Like a mix of wet dog, rotting meat, and something else I can't even describe. It was so strong it made my eyes water. Whatever was out there kept brushing against the trailer, making it rock slightly. The metal walls felt like they were closing in on us. The worst part was the sounds they made. Not quite human, not quite animal. Low, rumbling vocalizations that vibrated through the trailer walls. Sometimes it sounded like they were trying to communicate with each other. We could hear wood snapping in the forest around us, not small twigs, but big branches being broken like toothpicks. This went on for hours. We sat in the dark, backs against the kitchen cabinets, clutching our flashlights like they were some kind of weapon. The plywood over the windows creaked under the impacts of the rocks, but thankfully held. Around 4 a.m., something slammed into the trailer door so hard it bent the frame. The whole structure shook like it was about to come apart. I thought that was it. They were finally coming in for us. But they didn't. When dawn finally came, the area around the trailer looked like a war zone. Rocks everywhere, deep footprints in the mud, and long scratches down the trailer's sides. The door was dented inward, and 3 of the plywood sheets had cracked from the impacts. But the most disturbing thing was the pattern of the attacks. These weren't random acts of aggression. They were coordinated, strategic. They were trying to drive us out. I got on the radio and requested an emergency transfer, making up some story about trailer damage from a storm. My supervisor wasn't happy, but he agreed to process the paperwork. It would take a few days, though. Mike and I spent that time barely sleeping, jumping at every sound. During the day, we could hear wood knocking in the distance, like someone hitting trees with a baseball bat. Sometimes we'd catch glimpses of movement through the trees, just at the edge of our vision. Large, dark shapes moving with surprising grace for their size. The attacks continued every night, but they changed tactics. Instead of all-out assaults, they started playing mind games. They'd throw 1 or 2 rocks, then go quiet for hours. Just when we'd start to relax, they'd slam something huge against the trailer. The smell would come and go, always strongest near the windows, like they were trying to peer in through the cracks in the plywood. On what turned out to be our last night there, something changed. The attack started as usual, but around midnight, everything went dead quiet. Not just the creatures, everything. No insects, no wind in the trees, nothing. The silence was deafening. Then we heard what sounded like a female voice, somewhere between a whisper and a moan, right outside the trailer door. It was answered by a deeper sound from the woods, a long, mournful call that made the hair on my neck stand up. They were communicating, coordinating. That's when the trailer started rocking. Not the gentle swaying from before. This was violent, like they were trying to tip us over. We could hear multiple sets of hands pounding on the walls, the roof, the door. The plywood started splintering. Mike was praying, and I was just trying to stay on my feet as the trailer lurched back and forth. The door frame was bending inward with each impact. And then, just like that, it stopped. The silence returned, but different this time. We could feel them out there, waiting, watching. We stayed huddled in the kitchen until sunrise, afraid to move, afraid to breathe too loudly. When morning finally came, we didn't even pack. We just got in my truck and drove straight to the ranger station. My supervisor wasn't happy about us abandoning the post, but one look at our faces told him something serious had happened. The official report says the trailer was vandalized by bears. They sent another watchman up a week later with a new trailer, but he only lasted 2 nights before requesting a transfer. The site was eventually abandoned. I've spent years trying to make sense of what happened. Why did they target us? Why didn't they just break in when they clearly could have? Were they territorial, or was it something else? I've read about other encounters since then, but none quite like ours. Sometimes I think about going back, trying to find answers. But then I remember that smell, those sounds, the way they seem to be playing with us like cats with mice, and I know I never will. The strange thing is, I don't feel like they wanted to hurt us. Not really. They were sending a message. This was their territory, and we weren't welcome. Message received, loud and clear. I still work in forestry, but I stick to more populated areas now. Some places in this world aren't meant for us, and that's okay. I just wish I knew what they were protecting up there in those woods. Story 21. It was the summer of 2015, and I'd joined a local hiking group for what was supposed to be a 3-day trek through the forest. I'm originally from Asheville, so I'd been on plenty of trails in Pisgah before, but never for an overnight stay. The group consisted of 6 of us, me, our guide Mark, and 4 other hikers I'd just met that morning. The first day was exactly what you'd expect. Beautiful weather, good conversation, and the kind of peaceful atmosphere you can only find in nature. We covered about 12 miles before setting up camp for the night. I had my hammock with me, I've always preferred them to tents, and found 2 perfect trees about 30 feet from the main campsite. The others had their tents set up in a small clearing, but I liked my spot. It had a clear view of the sky, and the full moon that night was absolutely gorgeous. I must have dozed off around 10 p.m., but what happened later? God, I still get goosebumps thinking about it. I woke up suddenly, not sure why at first. You know that feeling when something just feels wrong? That's what it was like. The first thing I noticed was how quiet everything had become. No crickets, no rustling leaves, nothing. Just dead silence. Then I realized why I'd woken up. The moonlight that had been on my face was gone. At first, I thought maybe some clouds had rolled in, but when I opened my eyes just slightly, trying not to move, I saw it. There was something massive standing right next to my hammock, blocking out the moon. I'm talking massive. My dad is 6'2" and 230 pounds, and this thing made him look like a child in comparison. I could make out its silhouette against the night sky. It had to be at least 9 feet tall, with these impossibly long arms that hung down to mid-thigh. I've never been more terrified in my life. My heart was pounding so hard I was sure it could hear it. I kept my eyes barely open and tried to keep my breathing steady, pretending to be asleep. In my head, I started counting to 300. It's something I'd always done to calm myself down, but this time it was different. I was counting to stay alive. The smell was what got to me the most. It's hard to describe, like wet dog mixed with something rotting, but also musky. Not the typical forest smells I was used to. And the breathing, deep, rhythmic breathing, that seemed to come from something with lungs twice the size of mine. I made it to 300, counting every second, feeling like I might pass out from fear. Then somehow it got worse. The creature started to move, but not away from me. It leaned in closer. I could feel its breath on my face, warm and humid. I wanted to scream, to run, to do anything, but I was paralyzed with fear. I kept counting in my head, starting over again at 1. Finally, after what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes, it stepped away. The strangest part. For something so huge, its footsteps were almost silent. Just the faintest crunch of leaves, getting further and further away until I couldn't hear them anymore. I lay there until sunrise, not daring to move. When the first rays of light hit my face, I practically fell out of my hammock and ran to the others' tents. But what we found that morning made everything even more disturbing. About a quarter-mile down the trail, we found an abandoned campsite. And I mean recently abandoned. There was still warm coffee in a thermos, clothes scattered around, sleeping bags half pulled out of a tent, like someone left in a hurry. The weird thing was, nothing was broken or torn apart. It was just abandoned. But the creepiest part of the whole thing happened a few hours later. We were hiking out. None of us wanted to stay another night after finding that campsite, when we ran into this family, a couple with 2 kids. They asked us if we'd seen their dog, said it had run off the previous night. We told them no and kept walking, but about 20 minutes later, we saw what looked like the exact same family coming up the trail from the opposite direction. Same clothes, same kids, same everything. When we mentioned the dog, they looked at us like we were crazy and said they didn't have a dog. I've spent years trying to make sense of what happened that night. I've read about bears, about mountain lions, about every possible explanation. But nothing explains what I saw. Nothing explains that massive silhouette, those impossibly long arms, or that family that seemed to exist in 2 places at once. I haven't been camping since then. I sold all my gear, and I can't even look at hammocks anymore without feeling sick to my stomach. Sometimes when I'm lying in bed at night, I catch myself counting to 300 over and over, just like I did that night. I don't know what was out there in Pisgah National Forest, but whatever it was, it changed me forever. I know this sounds crazy. Hell, I wouldn't believe it if someone else told me this story. But I know what I saw that night, and I know something was out there. Something that shouldn't exist, something that defies explanation. And the worst part? Sometimes I wonder if it's still out there, standing next to someone else's hammock, breathing that same deep, rhythmic breath, waiting. Story 22. I experienced something in Big Sur back in 2012 that still gives me chills whenever I think about it. I was 23 at the time, trying to build my Instagram following by capturing stunning landscapes and living the van life that was starting to become trendy. Looking back, I was probably naive and overconfident, but I never imagined I'd encounter anything like what happened that night. I had found this incredible spot overlooking the Pacific, just off Highway 1. There was this small dirt turnout near a cliff edge that seemed perfect for parking my 1985 VW Westphalia for the night. I remember being so excited about getting sunrise shots the next morning. The forecast was perfect, and I had my Canon 5D Mark III all set up with my tripod. The evening was peaceful. I made some ramen on my little camping stove, edited some photos on my laptop, and eventually crawled into my sleeping bag around midnight. The only sounds were the waves crashing below and the occasional car passing on the highway. It was a new moon, so it was incredibly dark, but I felt safe in my van. I dozed off, but woke up suddenly around 1:50 a.m., I remember checking my phone, to what sounded like someone knocking on the side of my van. At first, I thought it might be a park ranger telling me to move, even though I was pretty sure overnight parking was allowed there. But then I heard these noises. They sounded almost like chimpanzees, but deeper and more guttural. My heart started racing because I knew there shouldn't be anything like that in Big Sur. The knocking continued, moving around the van's perimeter. I lay there frozen, trying to convince myself it was just some teenagers messing with me. That's when I saw it. This massive hand pressed against my side window. Even in the darkness, I could make out the details that still haunt me. Thick, dark hair covering the back of the hand, and skin that looked almost coppery. The fingers were impossibly long, and the palm was wider than my laptop. I started shaking uncontrollably. The hand disappeared, and then I heard heavy footsteps on the roof of my van. The whole vehicle shook under the weight. Whatever was up there was big, really big. I could hear it sniffing, taking these deep, powerful breaths that sounded almost like a horse, but more purposeful. My mind was screaming at me to get to the driver's seat and get out of there. I had left the keys in the cup holder, thank God. Moving as quietly as I could, I crawled toward the front of the van. That's when I made the mistake of glancing out the windshield. There was another one of them, crouched down right in front of my van. Even hunched over, its shoulders were impossibly wide, maybe 4 feet across. The streetlight from the highway caught its silhouette, and I could see matted hair covering its entire body. It was built like a gorilla, but wrong somehow. More human-like in its proportions, but massive. I let out an involuntary gasp, and its head snapped toward me. The eyes caught the distant light. They were deep-set and dark, but alert and intelligent-looking. That's when I noticed 2 more figures emerging from the tree line. They moved with this fluid grace that seemed impossible for creatures their size. Pure survival instinct kicked in. I lunged for the driver's seat, fumbling with the keys as my hands shook violently. The one on the roof started making this horrible sound, like a cross between a howl and a scream. The others joined in, and the cacophony was deafening inside the van. I finally got the key in the ignition and turned it. The old van sputtered to life, and I threw it into reverse, not even checking my mirrors. The creature in front moved incredibly fast, but I was already backing up. I felt a thud as the one on the roof either jumped or fell off. I didn't stop to find out which. I pulled a 3-point turn so fast, I'm surprised I didn't roll the van right off the cliff. As I accelerated onto Highway 1, I could see them in my rearview mirror, 4 massive figures standing in the road, watching me leave. They didn't chase the van, which somehow made it even more terrifying. It was like they didn't need to. I drove straight to the nearest Walmart parking lot, about 45 minutes away, and sat there with the engine running until sunrise. I was too terrified to even cry. It wasn't until the sun came up that I realized I'd left my camera equipment at the turnout. The camera, tripod, and my favorite lens, probably worth around $5,000 total. But there was no way I was going back. I've never returned to that spot. I sold the van a month later and moved back in with my parents for a while. I still do photography, but never alone, and never at night. Some people have suggested they were just bears, but I know what I saw. Those weren't bears. The way they moved, the way they worked together, those hands. Sometimes I still wake up in a cold sweat, remembering those eyes staring at me through the windshield. I don't post much about this experience because I know how it sounds. But I know what I encountered that night wasn't human, and it wasn't any known animal either. Whatever those creatures were, they seemed intelligent and coordinated. The scariest part is that I've since heard similar stories from that area of Big Sur, but most people are like me, too afraid of sounding crazy to talk about it publicly. Sometimes I wonder if they were just trying to investigate my van out of curiosity. But then I remember the way they surrounded me, the way they screamed. It felt predatory. Every now and then, I checked local news from that area, half expecting to read about someone else's encounter. But maybe others who've seen them are just like me, keeping quiet and trying to forget. Story 23. I had this idea that I thought would make his year. There was this old plowed field near our home in Cincinnati that I'd pass on my way to work. I'd bought some replica arrowheads online, planning to plant them in the soil so Jimmy could discover them. Looking back now, I feel so stupid for going there alone. But how could I have known? It was early October, around 4 p.m. The weather was perfect. One of those crisp fall days where the air just feels clean. I parked my truck on the side road and started walking toward the field. There was this stretch of woods I needed to cut through first, maybe about 200 yards of dense forest before reaching the plowed area. I remember checking my pocket to make sure I hadn't dropped any of the arrowheads when I first noticed something was off. You know that feeling when you're being watched? It started like that. At first, I tried to brush it off. Probably just deer, right? We get them all the time around here. But then I heard it. Movement in the undergrowth matching my pace. Whatever it was walking parallel to me, keeping its distance at about 40-50 feet through the thick vegetation. I stopped. It stopped. I took a step. It took a step. My heart started racing, and my mouth went completely dry. I'm not a small guy. I work construction, and I'm used to handling myself. But when I caught a glimpse of what was moving through those trees, my legs turned to jelly. Through the branches and leaves, I could make out this massive shape. It was unlike anything I'd ever seen before. The height, I'd guess around 5'5", doesn't sound that impressive, but the build was just wrong. It looked like someone had taken two people and somehow fused them together. The mass was just impossible. The worst part was how it moved. It wasn't clumsy or lumbering like you'd expect something that size to be. It was calculated, precise. Every time I tried to get a better look, it would shift position, always keeping just enough vegetation between us that I couldn't get a clear view. My first instinct was to back away slowly. That's when things got really bad. As soon as I started moving backward, it changed its pattern. It began moving closer to the trail, not charging, not rushing, just steadily closing the distance between us. The message was clear. It didn't want me retreating. I'd like to say I stood my ground or tried to figure out what it was, but that would be a lie. Pure instinct took over and I ran. I've never sprinted so fast in my life. I could hear it moving through the woods alongside me, branches snapping, leaves rustling. It kept pace easily, moving in and out between the trees, always staying just visible enough that I knew it was there. I burst out into the plowed field, my lungs burning. The thing stayed at the tree line, weaving between the trees, watching. I kept running until I reached my truck, fumbled with my keys, and somehow managed to get inside. My hands were shaking so bad I could barely get the key in the ignition. As I drove away, I kept checking my rearview mirror. Nothing followed me onto the road, but I swear I could see movement in the tree line until I turned the corner. The arrowheads are still in my desk drawer. Jimmy never got his archaeological adventure, and I never went back to that field. I told my wife I changed my mind about the whole thing, but I've never told her what really happened. How do you even begin to explain something like that? What keeps me up at night isn't just the encounter itself, it's the intelligence behind it. The way it herded me out of those woods, the calculated way it moved. It knew exactly what it was doing. Sometimes I wonder if I imagined the whole thing, but then I'll catch a news story about strange sightings in Ohio forests, and that feeling comes rushing back. I still drive past that field sometimes on my way to work. The trees look normal enough in the daylight, but I always speed up a little when I pass that stretch of road. Whatever I saw that day, it changed something in me. There are things in this world we don't understand, and sometimes it's better to just stay away. I've never gone hiking alone since then, and I've taught Jimmy to love baseball instead of archaeology. Some hobbies are safer than others, I guess. But every fall, when the leaves start to change and that crisp October air rolls in, I remember. And I wonder if it's still out there, waiting in those woods, watching other people walk past its territory.